and go.
Yeah. Anytime when you put up the slides, I can start, Tadem. Okay, so I'll just start anyway as the rest come in. So today is Masterclass 7. Welcome everybody to the C4 Southeast Asia Forum for Reporting. Today's masterclass is on democracy, power to the people, democracy, civil society, and resistance in Southeast Asia. So let me do a quick introduction. Oh, yes. Yeah, okay. So I'm from Kiniacademy. My name is Danny Yong. Kiniacademy is a trading arm of Malaysia Kini Group. Yeah, and we're mainly involved in the training of journalists. I like to say we've evolved to a little bit more than that. We are in media development now. So journalism training, we've been very involved with investigative reporting the past 2 years, and we've got we run projects that trains journalists and other interested parties on investigative journalism technique, as well as we have them go out there to chase down stories. And if you want to, you can check us out at fijiasia.com. Fiji being funds for investigative journalism initiatives. And this past year, we've also been working on collaborations within ASEAN. So to help journalists get together and know each other better and encourage more cross-border reporting and cross-border cooperation, right? And of course, C4 is one of our efforts. Yes, I did. So first, let us give thanks to our sponsors. The Institute of War and Peace Reporting is headquartered in London, and the ultimate sponsor for this project is the US, and they've been very supportive with us. Originally, this masterclass series is only 5. They've agreed for us to add 2 more, which is why we have 7 masterclasses today, being the last one. Let's go. Okay, so what we are trying to do with this project is to encourage journalists to engage with other journalists in ASEAN. So this project presents 2 overlaps. One overlap is the journalists are all from same reporting desks. So obviously they have a lot more in common than, for instance, the journalists that report on sports, for instance. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to have them connect on ASEAN-related topics. So by nature, the ASEAN-related topics tend to be more regional and more cross-border in nature. And this is how we also want to encourage this potential collaborations. So we want to do this in a sustained way. Sustained meaning this is not a one-time effort. We plan to repeat this next year. We've already got 10 newsrooms that are together to co-publish all the articles from here. I'll tell you more about it in a while. So C4 has got 3 main components. One, obviously, is the masterclass series. We have 7. You want to check out more about the rest of the masterclasses earlier on, you can go to c4.org. You can find the recordings of the masterclasses. You can find slides and even the transcripts. Yeah. Second thing is, as I mentioned, there are 10, 11 newsrooms that are part of this project from ASEAN as well as Timor-Leste, and they each work on a reporting project, yeah, in which a grant has been generously given to them by IWPR. So the third section, the third component is really a forum, is really the getting together of journalists. So we have a WhatsApp group that we welcome all journalists to be part of. And so obviously all the journalists, even though there are even some who are not part of the project, has jumped onto that WhatsApp group. So, the idea is they already would have the capability to reach out, whether in a group or via private message, right? And SEAFORE.org will be the central place. There's actually even a forum there, although it's not super active. Yeah, okay, let's move on. Coming to our masterclass today. So the idea in the masterclasses as we put them together is to get ASEAN voices to chime in and to present their perspectives to all these topics that we have selected. And so today we have 4 such people. We have Zakiah, we have Dr. Khoo, we have Dr. Welyne, Dr. Eduardo, and obviously all ASEAN based. I'll leave the main real introductions to Zakiah later. So before we start, do have your mics on mute. That doesn't mean we don't encourage conversation. We love for this to be a lively discussion, and that's exactly why we have this 4 eminent speakers with us, so that you journalists and everybody else can jump in and get their opinions on things. So even more important for journalists who might be writing stories on this subject matter, this is your opportunity to squeeze in a few questions to round off your report, right? So we encourage you to leave your video on and do submit questions and comments. As I mentioned, we really hope for this to be a discussion. Whether you want to switch on your video and ask a question live, or you can put it in the chat box. You can type in the chat box. Our team will check in on the chat box to take the questions. All right. This session is being recorded, so we will have the recording available in a few days in our website as well as our YouTube channel. Right. Additionally, in our YouTube channel, we actually will break it up into different sections of for each speaker. All right. So if you have missed part of this, you can actually go back in there and check out the videos. So we did a poll before on this just before our masterclass to get how you guys feel about our subject matter. So we asked the question, as a journalist, how often do you cover protests or resistance movements? So there's a fourth of you that says never. Frankly, I'm a bit surprised with that, considering so many so many things have been happening in Southeast Asia, including in Malaysia. Of course, we all know that. So let's move on. I'd be keen to get these guys to ask a couple of questions and tell us why, right? So how familiar are you with the history of resistance movements in Southeast Asia? So only 1 out of 8 say that you're not familiar. This is a perfect opportunity. C4 is about learning as well. And everybody seems to be a little bit more than familiar with our resistance movements. How important is protest and resistance in your country? Thankfully, most of you say yes, it's really important. I hope this person who's don't think it's important coming from a really peace-loving country, I guess. Okay, let's move on. In your country, which of these issues are frequently raised during protests? Most important ones that stood out is free and fair elections, then women's rights, and on third is indigenous rights, environmental concerns, corruption, and discrimination. So these are some areas we're going to touch on as well too. Let's move on. In your country, does art or visual culture act as a form of protest or resistance? 1/4 says no. So I guess there's an opportunity for political cartoonists to kind of spread their wings to this country. We perhaps should find that out for them. To what extent do civil society organizations in your country collaborate with other such organizations in Southeast Asia? This is something interesting, really, even for me. Four is sitting right on the fence. I would love to hear from the speakers of what civil societies have been doing to collaborate with other such organizations. We tend to be involved with with our own countries, especially those of us who are from countries who are quite a little bit troubled, right? So this might give opportunities, or rather suggest to other civil society organizations on a way to collaborate with each other outside the country. Great, good for collaboration. So let's get to the main event. So I will give a quick introduction of Zakiah. Her section is Resistance, Media Struggle to Report It As It Is. So Zakiah, she's a senior journalist. She's a writer, editor, producer. She started back in '95 as a feature writer in The Sun. She's got many years as a journalist. So she's worked with multiple organizations, including News Straits Times, Malaysia Kini, Harakah, TV Pass, MMP, Malay Mail, The Heat, Astro Awani, and The Star. So over the course of her career, Zakiah has taken many roles in the media, including reporting, translation, event management, production, and managing newsroom. This is really quite unique, from my knowledge of journalists. But her focus has always been politics and politicians, although she loves writing about the common man and his life. So in the late 90s, she covered Reformasi street protests in Malaysia. So Reformasi being one of the rallying cry in Malaysia. Conducted investigative reporting into Petaling Jaya's racial riots. That's one area in the Klang Valley. And she wrote the analysis and commentaries on social political issues. She's conducted many interviews with high-profile personalities, including Tariq Ramadan, Datuk Sri Nik Aziz, the former head of the late head of PAS, Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, Dr. Mahathir, Datuk Sri Najib Razak, Datuk Sri Abdul Hadi Awang, and many others. For Zakiah, a journalist's duty is always to ask the hard questions, even if you know you will not get a reply. So I'll hand this over to Zakiah. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Danny. I hope I'm loud and clear. Okay, Assalamualaikum, and a very good afternoon to everyone. I'll be facilitating this class today. It's my first master class, so I hope I will do you justice, for spending your time in this master class. As you know, I have been reporting politics. Most of the time it's reporting politicians, it's not politics, because of the what do you call, the laws and stuff that we have here in Malaysian media. And I have worked in both the pro-government. I have been on the side, in News Straits Times, it was a very pro-government, but at a time when we were allowed to also interview opposition. And then I've also worked with Harakah, which is the opposition, at a time when they were opposition, now they're in the government. So opposition party organ. And also that I've also worked with Malaysia Kini, despite a very short time, but a very, very meaningful time in my career. It's an honor for me to be with so many journalists and academicians and people who are interested in this discourse. And I'll just go, before I start, let us just recap the resistance movements that we have in Southeast Asia with a short video. Adit?
On February 1st, 2021, Myanmar's military seized control of the government. Millions took to the streets for peaceful protests, but the response turned deadly.
chaos on the streets of Jakarta. Thousands of students and workers staged rallies across the capital against the government's flagship jobs law. Clashes erupted as police fired tear gas and water cannon to disperse crowds who gathered near the parliament building. Some were throwing stones at police. This is the third day of clashes against President Joko Widodo's controversial new omnibus law. It's aimed at cutting red tape and boosting investment into Indonesia.
Australia dituduh telah melanggar hukum internasional karena tindakannya mengeksploitasi minyak di kawasan perairan Timor Leste. Selama ini tindakan eksploitasi Australia mengacu pada perjanjian pengolahan celah Timor yang disepakati Indonesia dan Australia pada tahun 1989. Para mahasiswa menuntut agar perjanjian tersebut berakhir karena Timor Leste sudah memisahkan diri dari Indonesia sejak tahun 1999.
Wearing protective medical gear, protesters gathered at the health department to demand more benefits. Today is the deadline set by President Rodrigo Duterte for the government to pay medical staff their risk allowances. But the government has said it needs more time. Nurses have threatened to resign and unions are warning of more strikes. The national tally of COVID-19 infections has breached 2 million.
Okay, so that was a very short video just to recap for what what is happening in Southeast Asia and what happened in Southeast Asia. Before we begin the class, I would like to present my keynote presentation, and I've titled it "Resistance: Media Struggle to Report It as It Is." Because that is the responsibility of a journalist. A true journalist reports it as it is without any salt and pepper. The reason I use the word resistance is because in Southeast Asia, could we keep it to that? Yeah. The reason I use the word resistance is because in Southeast Asia, we have many types of resistance, and this word encompasses all kinds of fights, rebellion, uprising, unhappiness, and unseating of the authorities. While we usually talk about resistance from the people, the masses, and the idea of resistance gives us the picture of, thousands of people on the protests, in protest on the streets, demanding for their rights. Over the years, resistance has taken on different forms. And with new media and social media, resistance need not only happen on the streets, but can even be successful in silent forms on tweets and Instagrams. We saw this at the beginning of the Arab Spring, especially in Egypt, when internet became the major tool for the youths to fuel the resistance against President Hosni Mubarak before people took to the streets. So the rising started on the internet itself. Sometimes it need not be resistance from the people, but also from within the government, such as political parties within the government, and then overthrowing the government from within, which happened not only once, but twice in the past 2 years in Malaysia. We had the case of, Pakatan Harapan, the opposition winning the 2018 general elections for the first time, unseating 60 years old party which ruled the government for so long. And then among themselves in Pakatan Harapan, there was a breakaway, and then they worked together with the opposition then, and they overthrew the government. And then through a movement called Sheraton Move. And after that, within that new government, which was called Perikatan Nasional, there was another resistance from the party itself, from another party, and that again brought to a government downfall, and now we have a Perikatan Nasional, Barisan Nasional government. So these are also resistance which the media struggles to report, because many of us journalists who are close to politicians, we know these things are happening. These things are, happening around under the ground, but it cannot be written. We cannot write, oh, this minister is fighting with this minister, and then there's going to be a government downfall in the next few days. We cannot write that, because we are governed by the laws, and we also have to be careful of clamp down by the powers that be that may think that we are out to unseat them. So that's why there are many types of resistance which the media struggles to report. Many of these things we write between the lines, and the attempts by media while they write these things is to appease the powers that were, okay, and then the powers that be and the powers that will be. So that is a fine line. I think a lot of the media in Malaysia is playing, and also in most of the countries in Southeast Asia. Okay, slide 3, please. I believe resistance happens in all aspects, and it can rise from within the very poor and the very rich, or everyone, especially when the country's authorities do not listen to the masses. There are types of resistance which can be very political oriented, which is what we hear about every day. Everybody thinks when we talk about resistance, it's all political. It's not. Okay, well, there are many other resistance movements which stem from social and economic reasons. Actually, the other two, social and economic, actually are the main causes that lead towards political resistance. The lines are very blurred, actually, but the usual causes of resistance are social and economic unhappiness. It's just common sense. A man well-fed, having all his needs taken care of, does not usually take to the streets or does not resist and listens to the authorities. But a poor and hungry man, on the other hand, that is the beginning of when the tables will start turning. So we can always remember, the governments, normally what they do is to ensure there's less resistance. They normally will make sure that their people are well fed, if they're smart, of course. The topic which we intend to cover today, anyway, is a very vast topic. We will never end it here. It is, probably a discussion which is as old as democracy and media themselves. Ever since there was a democracy and there was media, that is the struggle. Okay. I'm also looking forward from our speakers on what role does independent media play in keeping the world updated on the political situation? How can we best support suppressed media organizations and individuals? And what is required to refocus international attention on the violence inflicted in countries such as Myanmar? So these are things that we will be looking at. And we will also hear from the experts on how some of these reportings were and are being done in countries which not only threatens the media people, but actually carries out threats. We also hear how media people play the game of hide and seek between life and death in trying to get the stories out there to the people, to inform the locals and the world that there is something happening in the country. Despite the danger and fear and threats, we will also find out that the media has the responsibility to keep these stories of resistance on the front pages and keep them burning in the minds of the people. We definitely look forward to hearing that what are the ways we can push the authorities and groups such as ASEAN to ensure that the media gets to perform its duty without being targeted. And while I'm eager to hear from the speakers who are very, very experienced in this topic, I am more eager to hear discussion from the participants, as you may have been more hands-on. And I would like a class where the discussion is two-way and not just the droning of academic discourse. I hope the class will be as lively as a resistance movement should be. After all, I believe without the media, no resistance movement would be able to take on the form it wants to be. Without the media, there's no way. Okay. Okay. Just keep that. I think. Okay. What is resistance? You know, it is very funny. We see it is a paradox actually when we see countries whose governments came into being through the ballot box and claiming to be practicing democracy, and yet suppress or oppress the media from reporting the movements of uprising and unhappiness of the people, which actually led to the birth of the concept of democracy. So the government that came into being because of democracy. They allowed the people to vote. But when they came into being, then they started what they call putting their foot down on media reporting any other resistance which might unseat them. So in Southeast Asia, we have 11 countries, 10 of which are the ASEAN group. Then we have the newest country with the youngest democracy, Timor-Leste. Of course, Timor-Leste has been trying to get into ASEAN, but mainly Indonesia and Singapore have yet to agree to that. But of course, that is for another discourse and another masterclass by itself. And due to the lack of time and study purposes in this class alone, I would like to look at Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Philippines, Burma, and Thailand, which they have a lot of resistance movements, very obvious resistance movements, which make great case studies for the struggle of media reporting resistance. When we talk about reporting resistance, I refer to how media struggles to report uprising, dissent, and unhappiness among the people, which then translates to resistance movements and calls for reform, in some cases, even a possible revolution. We haven't had a very big revolution in Southeast Asia yet, but we had mini revolutions. And Timor-Leste was the one I think was the biggest because it actually broke away. And it is not all political, as Dr. Khoo will point out to you later. It's not all political, as many of these resistance movements begin due to social economic unhappiness, which then led to uprising against politicians. And then only do they turn into political uprising. I'm sure the speakers will be going into detail to explain the factors which leads to resistance. What we are looking at would be actually on how far the media reports for the masses and follow the demands of the citizens, especially in pursuit of desires for change, fight against corruption, and civil education, including for democratic change through elections. Excuse me. And we will also look at cases of alternative media, which succeeded in being an important source of information and opinion building, and make the traditional media rely on it as news source and as an important indicator of the people's pulse. Excuse me. I'm not really used to talking so much, being a reporter. Usually it's just asking questions and letting the others talk, you know. Myanmar is perhaps the currently most difficult country in Southeast Asia for media to report on resistance, as the junta does not spare any mercy in ensuring that the media is muzzled. Most recent was the case of US journalist Danny Yong, who was jailed for 11 years in Myanmar by a military court. The Frontier magazine managing editor have been accused the cough is getting to me. Okay. The most recent was the case of US journalist Danny Yong, who was jailed for 11 years in Myanmar by a military court. It is appalling that a journalist was tried in a military court, and the this magazine managing editor, was accused of a range of offences, which is quite normal in many Southeast Asian countries, including incitement, sedition, and terrorism. The only difference is they actually jailed him here. And since the coup by the junta in Myanmar, the military has also imposed internet blackouts, shut down satellite television, and cracked down on independent media, revoking the publishing licenses of a number of Myanmar news organizations, including Myanmar Now. Fenster is currently among some of the 100 journalists which have been detained since February, and about 30, I think, still remain in jail. And then in June, we have, two other journalists from the news outlet Mizima and one from the Democratic Voice of Burma, DBB, were jailed also under another law. It is a, colonial era law, which was revised to make spreading false news a crime. And many of these laws in many of the Southeast Asian countries are the colonial era law. In Malaysia, we had the ISA, which we did away, but then again, the remnants of it are still within some other laws. And then in Thailand, Philippines, and Indonesia, the resistance movements are quite obvious. Okay, with masses taking to the streets and being fought off by the authorities, the water cannons and all that. However, the other countries too, we are not saying they're all, peaceful and there's no resistance movements. The other countries, for Singapore, Malaysia, we have silent resistance from the people, such as inflation because of the prices and inability to vote. For example, in Malaysia, when the 18-year-olds were allowed to vote, but then they were not. They were allowed to vote, but they were not allowed to cast their votes as soon as possible. So, having covered politicians for more than 2 decades, I always believe that there are many ways of reporting such resistance. As sometimes the problem is in Southeast Asia, we have the big brother watching. So we always have to get creative, no doubt. For example, checking the price of the branded clothes, a leader wears is also one way of reporting on resistance. And many a time in Southeast Asian media, for example, in Malaysia, reports of luxurious watches or handbags of politicians or politicians' wives and triggered outcries from the masses that we can even say, proud to say that the media was the beginning of the movement of resistance. When people read this kind of reports, they start getting angry, they start questioning, and that's when resistance takes seed among the masses. The same tactics, and this is not something new. Okay, the same tactics were used in the Philippines in the 80s. During the uprising of the People's Revolution days, when the media there started reporting about Imelda Marcos, who was well known for a collection of shoes. This then led to the Filipinos forcing them into exile to Hawaii, as it became apparent that she and her husband, Ferdinand Marcos, the president, stole billions from the Filipino people, which I believe Dr. Eduardo they have yet to pay back in full. In Indonesia, before Suharto was taken down, it was the media which reported the lavish lifestyle and the poverty of the people. They put it side by side so that people judged for themselves. And this led to students on campuses printing from websites and spreading them on campuses before this fed the anger of the people against the corrupt government. Even though it happened in 1998, at that time Indonesia was still without internet. It was still without mass internet and cheap cheap connection. So at that time, when people did not really have handphones and stuff, small websites printed these things and then published these things, and then the students took it upon themselves to to print it and then distribute it. And that is how Suharto was taken down. It started in campuses. And I believe it was also the same for Malaysians about the same time during the Reformasi movement. And, the thing about Southeast Asia, the virus spreads very fast. And I'm not talking about COVID resistance. When Indonesia had the resistance movement, then Malaysia felt the heat and decided to do the Reformasi movement. The last straw was the sacking of former Deputy Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim then. And then the funny thing in Malaysia is, prior to the 2018 general elections, when 1MDB was being discussed, not many people understood what was 1MDB was about, because it was a massive corruption and thievery, which was done very cleverly. So the same group which fought for Reformasi, which resisted against Dr. Mahathir and brought him down, resisted again and brought him up again to be the 7th Prime Minister. So you have this is how the people resist. They resist, they are not loyal to one politician. So if they see that this politician is corrupt or they don't want them, they will resist and even bring back the old one. Okay. Thailand is a bit different from the other resistance movements in Southeast Asia, because it's an interesting case study, as the rebellion was not only against the elected authorities, but also against the monarchy. Okay, and in Thailand, monarchy is something very, very big. You can lose your life if you go against monarchy, because they have the lèse majesté law. So by the end of 2021, we saw leading figures such as, these names which might be, you must have heard it: Amanampa, Panupong Chatnok, Paritiawarak, Jatupat, Pansaya, Benja Apan, were all detained, and they are awaiting trial in series of detainments and releases. Some were imprisoned for more than 200 days since 2020, after Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha declared to use all laws, including lèse majesté, to the protesters. Lèse majesté is a law when you go against the king. Okay, and that is quite easy to use. If you say anything against the king, if you publish against the king, then you are, considered going against the king. And this law can even, put you behind bars for life. To recap Thailand, the early 2020 protests were against the government of Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha, but then later, included demands for reform of the Thai monarchy. So first it started as a resistance against the Prime Minister, and then, and then it became the demand for reform of the Thai monarchy when the monarchy did not, they realized that the monarchy was in defense of the Prime Minister. And as in many Southeast Asian countries, again, the university campuses was the hotbed for the beginning of the resistance. The large demonstration by the Free Youth Umbrella at the Democracy Monument in Bangkok demanded for changes to the government of Thailand, the dissolution of parliament, ending intimidation of the people, and the drafting of a new constitution. It was, it had all some of the elements of the Hong Kong umbrella movement, which did not really have an overall leader. And this is quite common in Southeast Asian countries. On 3rd August of 2020, two student groups publicly raised demands to reform the monarchy, breaking a long taboo of publicly criticizing the monarchy. And a week later, 10 demands for monarchy reform were declared. The 19 September rally saw 20,000 to 100,000, could have been more. And this was regarded as an open challenge to King Vajiralongkorn. And this normally does not happen in Thailand, where they're very, very loyal to the king. And this is when it happens, the media also decided to jump on, they decided that they just have to report, okay, which was not easy for them to do as well. A government decision to delay voting on a constitutional amendment in late September fueled nearly unprecedented public Republican statement and mass protests on 14 October. They declared state of emergency in Bangkok, citing what they call alleged blocking of royal motorcade. So then 16 October, we saw the water cannons coming in, the first crackdown by police, and those things that we saw on TV. But it was worth it. They thought it was worth it because in November, the Thai Parliament, voted to pass 2 constitutional amendment bills. But then their content shut down the protesters' demands of abolishing the Senate and reformation of the monarchy. So basically, they pretended that they were going to amend the constitution, but at the end, they lashed back at the protesters. And clashes between the protesters and the police and the royalists, you have a big number of royalists in Thailand, became more prevalent. And the first protester died in October 2021, just recent. And with the video showing that he was shot with live rounds by a person inside the police station, which actually was very big. Okay, I did next slide. Oh, okay, what is the intimidation? The responses to resistance from the authorities and powers that be come in various forms. It can be subtle or overt or plain defensive. Okay, in countries where with the emergency decree, this is the first thing that the governments will reach out when they have lost all control and they know that they cannot, they cannot win against these protesters. Throughout, usually the responses from the authorities sometimes tend to verge on the overkill, and that further results in fueling the resistance or forcing the rebellion to go underground, albeit for a while. Many a time, although the governments might be tempted to give in, okay, it's when you see thousands of your voters on the streets, they might be tempted to give in. Southeast Asian governments usually do not do so at one go. They might make some amends, given a little bit, but then again hold back and then use those requests which the protesters had asked for to entice the masses in the next election to get voted again. So they play this game. And so far, the government responses in Southeast Asia against resistance and resistance reporting would be including, filing criminal charges under the emergency decree. And this emergency decree is in most countries are the colonial era law. Arbitrary detention, police intimidation. Police are very are not independent in Southeast Asian countries, so they are used very freely by the powers that be. They delay the tactics, the deployment of military information warfare units. We have the cyber troopers and all. And then you have the media censorship, which is shutting down the internet, shutting down portals, threatening. We also have that in Malaysia to a certain extent. The mobilization of pro-government royalist groups, who have accused the protesters of receiving support from foreign governments or non-governmental organizations as part of a global conspiracy. Okay, this is a very Western funding is the favorite term to bring back images of colonialism. And I'm sure Malaysia Kini has gotten it many times. I'm sure, when you get funded, you will see, okay? And then the deployment of thousands of police protests, that is usually done, to show power, okay? And just to recap once again, the ASEAN countries tend to work very much in the same fashion when it is trying to put a lid on resistance. While one government may point to another for not listening to their masses in their own country, the same resistance resistance back in their own country will likely be dealt with the same way. They forget when you point one finger to the other person, the other four, what do you call, the thumb and this one is pointing back at you. So, for example, ASEAN countries have lambasted Myanmar for not condoning human rights on Rohingya and the need for the junta to play to the people. However, the cases of Aborigines and minorities in countries, in Malaysia and in Brunei and all this still go on. And when it comes to talking about media censorship, despite many, many engagement, ASEAN leaders shy away most of the time. And it is not a popular subject. It's never discussed openly, as all member countries are very well aware that should they talk about it, they might be picked on by the others. So perhaps they rather, just call each other black inside and stay as it is. So without, the slide. So these are countries with massive resistance, as I pointed out, with major struggle for media reporting resistance. Myanmar is the most dangerous. Philippines, you have big climb down to the extent of closing down, the ABS network, and then closing down of the portals for which the portal founder actually got a Nobel Peace Prize. And then you have Indonesia, and although things seem calm at this time, but Indonesia is actually facing some resistance because of the promises that Jokowi made, which they believed. But according to Indonesian journalists, they say that it is now not an overt defensive take that the government is using, but they are using a more subtle. So they have laws which talk about economic online and digital things, but actually they're trying to clamp down the media. So that is what the journalists are saying. So Indonesian government probably has gotten smarter in how to deal with resistance. Then you have Thailand, which is open resistance. And then you have Singapore, which has very, very strict control on its media. But it is there between the lines. It is being reported. There are cases of opposition, but Singapore is as we all know, it's a tightly controlled. The opposition is still a fledgling, despite the advance that they have made is fledgling. So these are the countries with massive resistance. We are not saying that they don't have resistance in other countries, but these are countries which we see. For example, Malaysia, for now, the resistance is not very big, but it's in spurts. When something happens, then people talk about it, but they have yet to take to the streets again, like what we did in during the Reformasi movements. Next slide, please. So, is that all the slides? Ade?
So sorry, there was a slight technical difficulty just now. So if you'd like to resume from slide 25.
So without further ado, I've been going on and on. So let us go to the topic of today. Okay, power to the people, democracy, civil society, and resistance in Southeast Asia. A very, very big topic, a very, very interesting topic. But, nevertheless, we have to, it has been discussed over and over and over, but we have to keep discussing. So the speakers today are Dr. Hooi, Dr. Welyne Jehom, and Dr. Eduardo C. Tadem. And all are experts on the topic of power to the people and democracy, as well as on media responsibility. So Dr. Khoo will be speaking on understanding protests and movements of resistance. And Dr. Khoo will be highlighting the various forms of protests and movements of resistance. You will realize that the concept of a protest can vary in many ways. And protests can come in the most subtlest of forms. Okay, Dr. Welyne will be speaking on the art of resistance, protest, and visual culture in Southeast Asia. This will be very interesting and will prove to be useful to journalists, because when you describe the movements of resistance in your stories, you need to know whether this is actually a resistance and what kind of art is it. You know, you need to explain to the masses, look, there is a resistance happening, this is why. You can't, if you can't use the word resistance, what other forms can you use? What other, because a journalist, as far as I believe, is a what they call an artist as well. So we write it with words, we write it in visual forms, you know. So this will prove to be very useful for journalists to learn and understand how the resistance movements can be made known and shown and visualized by the masses for the masses. So if it is just one man standing, you know, immolating himself, that is, you know, it is not, people might not say that's resistance because there's just one man, what they call burning himself. But actually, it is the beginning of resistance. So these are types of resistance which Dr. Welyne, of course, will go into depth later. And Dr. Eduardo will talk about the Southeast Asian civil society engagement with the ASEAN process, challenges and alternatives. He will point out the small steps of achievements which have been made with such engagements, and also the need for a stronger push from all sectors to further engage and to further push to get the powers that be to listen to the voices of the masses, especially the media. And I'm sure Dr. Eduardo has also, you know, is taking a lot of effort to get the leaders of the ASEAN to actually listen and hear and talk about the need for media to be given that freedom to report resistance. And I think I've taken, is my time up, Adi?
No, you still have some time if you want to answer some questions, but if you'd prefer to move on to the next presentation, yeah, we can do so.
You know, the speakers might need more time to discuss. I will now hand over to the first speaker. Is Dr. Khoo ready?
Yes.
Dr. Khoo, so I will hand it over to you. So the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Zakiah, for the keynote presentations and broad views about the resistance in Southeast Asia, especially from the view as a reporter. In my sessions, I'm going to talk about understanding protests and movements of resistance. I must say that I'm very excited to share this topic with all of you here as an academic who have the background in the human rights. In the context of Southeast Asia, I must say the discourse, especially the academic discourse on social movements and resistance in Southeast Asia is rather limited if I look at it from the academic point of view. And from that perspective itself, I think it has impacted on the way that the reports are being written and so forth. So those are basically the ideas that I'm going to put forward here. But in my sessions, I'm going to take a step back, as in I will go to a more foundational perspective in terms of understanding the movements broadly, not only applicable in the context of Southeast Asia, but rather to understand it on the view from, I have divided my presentation into 4 parts. The first part is on the broad views and the concepts, different concepts that we use. Like just now, Zakiah mentioned she preferred to use the word resistance. As we see from the reporting, different journalists from different countries, they use different terminologies. I see many journalists who cover on Myanmar, they like to use the word pro-democracy movement. So there are many different terms that we can use. Nevertheless, some of the terms can be different when we interpret it from the academic view. So my second part of my presentations will go into the theory, but of course I will not talk about this solely from the academic view, but the theories, the evolution of the social movement theory is very interesting, in which it actually tells us what are the elements that are being covered in the media and how this can actually generate new story ideas and so forth from the theoretical point of views. And my third part will be on the stages of social movements, because see, there's a lot of reporting that they normally started to report about the movements when the protests in the streets happen. But it is not way before, when there has been some grievances and things like that. But of course, from the other side, there are obstacles that the journalists face as well, and the resources and things like that. But however, social movement does have its own process and things. And my fourth, before I conclude, I will be providing just a very brief views about the media reporting, and of course talk about the biasness and so forth, and how it can actually impact on these social movements progress in the Southeast Asia. So from the very much historical perspectives here, on the global views, I did my thesis on the electoral reform movement, BERSE. So when I was doing my PhD on BERSE at that time, I must say that it has been rather challenging to find social movement scholars in the Southeast Asia. We do have, however, there are rather limited literatures that are being available. And hence, a lot of literatures are very much from the Western scholarships, where from the global point of views that there's the rise of the democratic representation, especially in the US and England in the late 70s, where the social movements are basically highly associated with democratic societies. Hence, when we put in the context of Southeast Asia, we know there are many countries who remains to be non-democratic, authoritarian, and so forth. So there has been a lot of discussions and debates on how do we then use the Western scholarship to be applied into the context of Southeast Asia alone. So, however, the social movement studies evolved in the late 19th and the 20th centuries, whereby there has been more dynamic interaction between the democratic societies and the process of democratizations, and in authoritarian societies as well. So when we're talking about a lot of resistance movements that Zakiah was mentioning just now, is all about the process of democratizations, even in the context of Malaysia as well. So my view here, and some scholars is that social movements plays a huge part in terms of the process of democratizations. But we understand that from Malaysia and many other parts of Southeast Asia, protests or movements always being seen in a negative perception, as in something that is rather negative, but not looking at it from the view that it can actually contribute to the social and political change. So in the mid-1970s, there's a lot of research on collective actions coming from the emotional and psychological approach. So this is one part of the things that is missing in a lot of the reportings here, because a lot of reports focus on the political actors, the institutions, systems. Rather, in fact, when we talk about social movements and the resistance, there's a lot of elements coming from the emotions and the psychological approach, as in coming from the discipline of political psychology, to understand why do people protest, what are the factors that the movements actually occur, and what are the impacts. So those are the things from the global view. So from the regional perspective, of course, one of the main challenges that always come about is the heterogeneous identities and the diverse historical and geopolitical circumstances in Southeast Asia. I think this does not only put the challenges in terms of the academic literature, but it also put a lot of challenges when it comes to the reporting. So there are many reporting that focus only on country context. Rather, if we want to put it in a more regional context, it can become a little bit more challenging. So there is a need to actually look at many different elements that come about when we understand the social movements. So just now, Zakiah has mentioned about some of the previous resistance struggles in different countries. I think late 1990s, we saw some of the fall of authoritarian regimes, and then of course the waves of Arab Spring and the Occupy Wall Streets basically renewed the developments from small-scale mobilizations to mass movements somehow in the academic literatures, and in terms of we can see more reporting on the protests and the movements as well. So it somehow becomes part of the political process and being normalized, because one of the factors is the emergence of the opposition forces and civil society. I think one of the countries that remains to be underreported is Cambodia, which is in one of the countries that requires a lot of media attention in examining what is really happens in Cambodia, apart from we are talking about Myanmar, Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, and other countries. So, so there are similar levels, but different styles of the state repression that I see from all the Southeast Asian countries. If we look at Singapore, it is at the different levels where it's a huge economic growth there. However, when we talk about democracy, there's really a lot of things that we want to talk about, resistance and the hindrances and the legislations as well. So moving forward on the different concepts, I think there are many different concepts that we can use. Some we use social movement, but basically social movement refers to a loose network of the people who share the same grievances and engage into the collective actions. But there are also terminology that we call social movement organization. In fact, for Bersih, it is considered as an organization because it is being institutionalized. So however, of course, in the media, this term is hardly being used as well. So political movements, some that are more in pushing for political change. Protest movement is quite popularly being used as well, or resistance movements. Revolutionary movements basically refer to movements that attempt to overthrow a government. Civil disobedience is being used very frequently to describe Myanmar movements, civil disobedience movements, and civil resistance concept is basically refer to non-violent resistance. So I think there's these things between violent versus non-violent resistance that we talk about. So from the academic view, terminology, civil resistance basically refer to the non-violent. So for the civil society is another concept that many reportings are being used, but however, civil society is extremely broad. Civil society actors, sometimes it is being misused because it's basically send out different messages to people when you just put everything as civil society. So NGOs are part of it, where some they tend to use just NGOs to describe the movements, and then movements describe it as an NGO. So there are many actually different terms that should be used and should be carefully being within as well. So I will just like to focus a little bit more about this social movement concept by Charles Tilly, a prominent scholar in the social movement studies, by focusing on the worthiness, unity, numbers, and the commitments that he used here. So very interestingly, the WUNC that Charles Tilly has been put forward is that those are the things that actually media has been reporting about. Nevertheless, it is not really being put together in a more comprehensive reporting, because sometimes I see the issues is that when we go for different commentators, they might have their own biasness. So when you go for politicians or political commentators, they might not look at movements from the movement point of view. They will always tie movement together with politics, but it's not everything should be politicized. There are more things to talk about the movement. So WUNC is very useful, whereby when we talk about worthiness, basically is referring to the component that is most directly related to how protesters actually behave while protesting. So worthiness here is really referring to the non-violent behaviors that the movements would like to show. There is no movements that actually, when we talk about social movements, that would like to engage into the violent approach first. So the second one is the unity. I think the unity component is always being put up by the media reporting, of course. So basically, unity refers to the agreement among the protesters. So unity does not actually deal with the substantive message the protester broadcast, but it deals with the extent to which how the media is shared among the participants. So for instance, the question of do they really have a common claim shared by all? So unity can most of the time not be observed directly. So it can occur in the head of the protester. So that's why very often we see protesters typically attempt to evoke their unity visually and behaviorally. So numbers, I think numbers is something that all the media are very familiar with. How many actually go down on the street and how many likes or twitters or how many tweets and things like that. And we always know that the numbers can be very, very different. However, this is really, really challenging actually. When you put up a number that doesn't really represent the diff, it really can impose a lot of impacts to the protesters. So the numbers is one thing that I think media should pay a little bit more careful in reporting when it comes to numbers. So, and then the commitment, of course, the appeal or threat generated by a movement really also depends on the degree of the commitment the protester display. But of course, movements relies on media a lot, and very often coming from the media lens, I know there are challenges that the media and the reporters that have to face. However, when the message of the movement is not being put up in a way that the goal is supposed to achieve, it can actually impact on that movement itself. For instance, if I take Bersih is only known as useful if they go down on the street, whereby their original goal is not go on the street, but people have associated with the image on the media that Bersih is yellow and it is street protest. So I believe that is a huge challenge imposed to Bersih in terms of, they actually wanted to do voters education. So those are the things that, however, it has been more than a decade that Bersih has been and has to suffer with that kind of image. So it actually put a lot of impacts on Bersih in terms of their sustainability. And another point that is not being pointed out by Tilis, but by other scholars is about diversity. So when it comes to the diversities here, it's really applicable in the context of Southeast Asia, because sometimes when the media reporting also, we have to show, nowadays, I think a lot of medias put up the youth are part of the protest movements and things, but really it is not really only the youth sometimes in some of the protests, but it is a mixture of the different groups as well. So sometimes the diversity itself is also very important to show and to create awareness about the certain forms of the protest. So social movements, I will move a little bit to the social movement theories here. Basically, what I have highlighted just now as well, that it is an interdisciplinary studies. Hence, the point I would like to really put up is that it is not just about political science, scientists looking at social movement, but really from the political psychology views as well and so forth, that I hope that this can reflect in the media reportings a little bit more in the context of Southeast Asia. So the evolution of social movement theory is very similar with what I have mentioned about. In fact, we talk about resources. Yeah, so we know some movements, they have existing resources, but some, I think a lot of movements in the context of Southeast Asia, they do not have much resources. And one of the resources is actually media. Media is everywhere, and media is extremely powerful when we talk about movements, about they can either they can really impact heavily on the movements and how it is being progressed, whether it can actually achieve the goals or it doesn't. So the political process theory is the one that I'm going to focus here, and this is the theories that I use in describing the developments and the formations of the BERSI here. So resource mobilizations theory basically is not something that most of the movements in Southeast Asia has, because it not only refer to the financial resources, but of course it also focuses on the media resources and so forth as well. And the media, as we know, the challenges in the context of Southeast Asia, where some are state-owned, some are party-owned, and some can be non-independent. So those are the things that most of the movements in Southeast Asia do not have the luxury with. That is to have a more independent reporting about their goals. So, but resource mobilization theory basically telling that the actions of the members and participants are rational. I think this is one of the challenge that, you know, when of course media are doing the reporting, it is in a way that it is a platform to create awareness as well. So very often public see participants are irrational, but from the social movement studies view, the participants and the protesters are all being recognized as rational actors. But of course, it can open up to a little bit more debates. So political process theory is basically looking at how the external opportunities can actually help the movements to grow. So this is one of the things that a lot of reporting are actually focusing on that. However, what I would really like to show is here. The political opportunity structures derived from the political process theory from Doug McAdam, in which he divided into this theory into 4. So if you look at popular access to the political system, division within the elite, the availability of allies, and the state repression, all of these somehow have been regularly being reported by the media in the different reportings, taking pieces by pieces. You know, I think one of the things that being very often being reported is the elements on the state repression. So we know state repression can affect the mobilization, whereby mobilization is one of the key things that social movements have to survive on, how they can mobilize the people. The availability of allies, look into different allies. One of the allies is the political party. Another allies can be media. So I will skip the media as we already know, but political parties, this is where it becomes issues in some of the countries, because if a movement is close to the opposition political party, which most of the time in the context of Southeast Asia share the same grievances, then they will be talking about, you know, the movements are no longer independent. But from the social movement studies point of view, that is totally accepted up to the different political context. Because if we look at the past histories, a lot of independence movement, resistance movement actually turn into political parties. So those are the things that I think in the more public discourse has been missing out. Popular access to the political systems, of course, refer to the movements do not have the regular access to the political powers. Hence, we have the social movements. So I think sometimes the media also reporting on this. However, it's not really being that in-depth. And the divisions within the elites basically refers to the fragmentations that happen with the political elites, either some of the high-profile politicians or some of the different class, privileged classes of the people or middle class, up class that actually join into the movements that can actually provide opportunities to the movements to grow. So basically the POS, political opportunity structures, can constrain or expand the collective action in many, many ways. I think I would just like to want to focus is that they can actually create opportunities for the opponents. I think in the case of Malaysia, we see the red shirt. So when you have a lot of media reporting on the BERSI, in one point, I mean, from the social movement studies point of view, it shows that BERSI movement had successfully actually penetrate into the society. Hence, you have the backfire. Hence, you have the counter movements like red shirt. So of course, opportunities like this can be used in both ways. My third part of it, stages of movement. So very often, a lot of reporting happens in the second stage on the coalescence stage, in which when the movements are already managed to actually gather a lot of discontent or frustrations coming from the different populations, and the leadership has emerged somehow, and the strategies of success are being mapping out. So in the emergence is basically just a widespread discontent. So there are many reportings, of course, to say that, you know, there have been people not happy with the economic policies in the countries and so forth. However, I think what is really lacking is perhaps more reportings that can a follow-up reporting to the discontent or grievances that happens in their countries. So to follow the story a little bit and provide a more comprehensive reporting. So on the stage 3 of the reporting is basically bureaucratized, is the institutionalizations of the social movements, whereby it is being characterized by the high levels of organizations and the coalition-based strategies. I think coalition-based strategies is something that Brazil is doing, and it comes about from the limited resources that most of the movements have. And at the stage where they are bureaucratizing, they can no longer just rely on the mass rallies or any leaders to progress towards their goals. So those are the moving to the third stage. And the fourth stage, decline. Decline stage can be divided into 5 different phases. So success means that, you know, the movement basically has managed to achieve the goals. Failure normally happens when they are faced with a lot of state repression, very high state repression. Co-optations happen where some organizations or movements can be highly dependent on centralized authority or charismatic leadership. So when the movement leaders come to associate with the authorities, the leader could be, you know, being co-opted into the systems, and that can contribute to the decline of the movement itself. And another one is the repressions, whereby the authorities or the agents acting on behalf of the authorities use the measures, sometimes violent, to actually control or destroy a movement. And the last one, go mainstream, basically meaning that the goals or ideologies are adopted by the mainstream, in which this is hardly happened in the context of Southeast Asia. But this is basically the stages of social movements that I would like to share. And now I go to my very last part and the concluding quickly. And mediating message, of course, just now I mentioned media is really, really important when we talk about social movements. So activists, of course, they need the media to convey message to wider audiences. However, we are always talking about these framing issues, how the media frame that movements, ideas, ideologies, and the goals are very, very important, as it can directly impact on the process of developments of that particular social movement itself. So media coverage can help marginalized actors set a social and political agenda, but how often does it help? And I think in some of the instances, it can actually create some backfire as well, depending on how the media is reporting on that. But basically, if we put it in the lens of the activist movement, must frame injustice to convince as wide an audience as possible that the problem exists and the collective efforts at redress are efficacious. So the biasness in reporting, I think, is something that the journalists face dilemma with. There are different types of biasness. One, selective selection bias, which protests get covered. Most of the protests that get covered are the big protests. There are many protests, or protests. When I say protest, it doesn't mean on the street protest, but many movements are not being covered, unfortunately. Yeah, depending on the issues. So nowadays, a lot of things are talking about environments, climate change. So most of the focus are all gone to anything to do with environment. So other kind of movements that fight for other rights can be actually marginalized in such a way. So those are the things that can impact on the movement. Description bias, how is protest being described, is extremely important, and it can actually kill a movement itself by putting the different narratives on that movement. So explaining biasness, of course, this is basically focusing on organizational factors, structural factors, and ideological factors. I think this is very common dilemma for many journalists here. That one thing is that journalists can be generalists as well, because you can't expect a journalist must be trained in a social movement studies to cover on a movements. So that takes a lot of research and so forth. But sometimes that can actually impact on how the reporting is being done, and can impact on the development of the movements. Structural factors, this is something that a lot of medias are facing, advertising avenues, and what kind of report that you should do and things like that. Ideological factors, and sometimes perhaps the personal bias coming from the journalist can also impact on how the movement is being framed in the media as well. So in the conclusion, I would just like to put up a few ideas and suggestions here. I think interdisciplinary reporting is really important, as in looking at movements from a different lens, not only always start out with the state actors, but perhaps I know there's a lot of stories and narratives that looking at the protesters, but sometimes it is very much selective, only on the several phases. So I think those are the things. Changes in public policy, that means to tie the movements with the changes in the public policy. That means any form of political change, for instance, Bersih and electoral reforms. So those are some of the things that have been being reported quite successfully in a way. Yeah? Social movements and democratizations. So this is basically, even in globally, there have been growing literatures in terms of linking movements and the democratizations, because democratization is a process where there's a lot of focus on the state actors. There's little focus on movements, or even in a broader way, the civil society, how they can contribute to the process of democratization. So this is one of the things that I would like to put up here. And my final point is that protest is not all just marching in the street, but protest can be many, many other forms as well. I say this because this is the very first challenge that I faced when I introduced the course on social movements and democratization in the University of Malaya. My first class of the students, basically, they think, is she going to teach me about how to go to the street to protest when they see the word movements? So there's a lot of negative perceptions in terms of protest. So protest can be in any form. It doesn't need to be just on the street. So, and that tied up with how we view the concept of movements and the resistance as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ying Hooi. Okay, I'm sorry I rushed into you without introducing for everyone's what you call knowledge. Dr. Khoo Ying Hooi is a senior lecturer at the Department of International Strategic Studies, Universiti Malaya, and she's what you call teaching at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences in Universiti Malaya. She's also the editor-in-chief of the Malaysian Journal of International Relations, and she sits in the editorial board of the Journal of Current Southeast Asian Affairs, Journal of Southeast Asian Human Rights, and Indonesian Law Review, ILREV. She has been active in the works related to human rights and democracy in the Southeast Asian region for more than a decade, and is very much consulted by NGOs and even to some extent the government bodies who are interested to find out what exactly, how exactly to deal with resistance movements. She's very well versed. We have one question from Thailand. Would you want to take that first, Dr. Khoo?
Yeah, sure, I can. Thank you, Zakiah. So basically, I think Ratanaporn asked about the word non-violent and violent resistance movements. Basically, when we understand movements from social movements from the perspective of social movement studies, social movements is a movement that engage into the non-violent approach. So we do not talk about the violent approach. So, but however, there are movements that are using the violent approach. Even when we talk about Hitler, he started the political parties from a movement. So those are the violent approach, as in how I define the violence and the non-violence is basically non-violent means you're not using any forms of violence in terms of weapons, in terms of hurting another person and so forth. But basically, you go for the approach of engaging in terms of, because I think in the context of Southeast Asia, what's missing is that the role of police, the role of authorities. When we talk about the role of authorities, many people have the perception that the police is on the ground to actually stop the protest, in which that is not the role of the police. They should be the one who facilitate. I think that is the one that is missing here when we talk about the role of the police here. So police roles and the authorities should facilitate the protesters on the street to make sure it is peaceful. So when we talk about non-violent, basically it's through a peaceful means, and the violence is through a non-peaceful means. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Khoo. It was interesting when you mentioned about the numbers. We have this problem when, as reporters, when we are out reporting on the ground, you see you're amongst the people, but you can't really count the numbers. I think Malaysian reporters found a way of doing what you call the struggle with that during the Reformasi movements, because the government is saying one thing, the police is saying one thing, the organizers are claiming millions. It can range from 10 to millions. So, and then you have what you call photographs being put out because of the advance in what you call the technology. One will show there's 1,000 people, and then another picture will show there's like 10,000 people, and the smart ones will dissect the photo and then find out that, oh, this is cut and paste and all that. So media gets into a bind over that. So it is interesting, if there is a way of calculating how many people are in one group. I think there are ways which I think we regarded, we tried to do in Malaysia Kini. We actually, counted people to a certain extent, and then, tile them up, 50 here, 50 here, 50 here, that kind of thing. So, but that is a struggle. That is a struggle. What does media do when they're faced with that? The organizers are claiming 10 million people are marching, while what they call the government says, no, it was only 100 people. So would you want to answer that?
Yeah, I acknowledge that challenge, and I must say I do not have solutions for that. Hence, that's why I mentioned about this WUNC. Perhaps the reporting can add on with that. From academic writing, we normally say that, there are different numbers that given by different parties. However, we should look at the other factors, such as the commitments and the worthiness and the unity from the people. But I'm not sure whether this can be done in the media reporting, but that's how we do that in the academic way. Yeah.
So numbers in the eye of the beholder. Yeah. Okay, so okay, we will take a short break, 10 minutes break. It is now 15. It is now 4 o'clock, so we come back at 4:10, and after that we will hear from Dr. Welyne, Jeffrey, Jehom. So 10 minutes break for everyone. Hello, everyone. Are we all here? Okay. Okay, can you hear me? All right.
Yes.
Okay. So we move on. Our next speaker is Dr. Welyne. Let me get her name correct. It's okay, Dr. Welyne Jeffrey Jehom. I hope I've said it correctly. She's a senior lecturer, Department of Anthropology and Sociology, also from Universiti Malaya. Okay, and she's with the Faculty of Arts and Social Science, and she has been with Universiti Malaya since 2009. She was also the head of Center for Indigenous Studies from 2018 till June 2021. And her research interest focuses on community-driven development that includes the development of indigenous knowledge for community livelihood and women empowerment. She's quite well sought after by the media for her knowledge on indigenous issues. And to share indigenous knowledge from her research with the wider public, she has curated cultural heritage exhibitions for educational purposes, highlighting the digital polysensory exhibition concept, and has exhibited both in the country and internationally between 2015 to 2018. She works very closely with the communities partnered in her research through various engagements, including establishing a community enterprise with the community. Her foremost research interest is currently on the fostering of the local approach in the conservation of indigenous knowledge. She's currently completing her book on Iban Pakumbu weaving for a sustainable community development. I am not sure if Dr. Welyne, are you from Sarawak? Okay, so Iban as well. No, okay. All right, Dr. Welyne, I will be talking about the art of resistance, protest, and visual culture in Southeast Asia. From the hearts of Borneo itself, Dr. Welyne. So please, do start. You can unmute your mic. I think you have. All right. Okay.
Yes. Thank you, Zakiah, and thank you, SEAFORE, to invite me to give this sharing. I wouldn't call it lecture. I will call it sharing, because I think I'm going to take a different approach to discuss the art of resistance. And first, I would like to share what I'm going to discuss here is what is art activism. And then I will look into the diplomatic and democratic way of protest by highlighting James Scott's work. There are two important books. Yeah, I will show you later. And then I'm going to zoom into indigenous rights, culture, and protest movements. We were speaking about non-violent movement, non-violent protests. So I will be focusing on that. And I'm not going to go into a lot of topics, but discussing the previous work that can be taken as examples in way to protest, and then and also in a way to take sources for reporting. Yeah, and then I will just speak about the work of the Orang Asli, how they actually start this very slow but very effective movement. Silently, sometimes they protest, but the way of protesting is very visual on art activism. Okay, next. Sorry, now I have to say next. Okay, I purposely put here, like I would like to share with you what art is all about. You know, like I am very sure that you know what art is all about, but we also have to know that art has power, Yeah, I'm just going to read from here. So impactful art has the power to do more than just grab the audience attention. And that's the whole reason why we have paintings, we have very powerful visual documentaries, we have photos, we have murals, we have monuments. We also have, did I mention mural already? Also certain kind of assembles that has been put out in order to convey the message. Yeah. So most of these kind of things like assembles of stuff like trees or branches or bottles or whatever can be found all over the world, but we just don't pay attention to it. Okay, so it can send global messages of statement and solidarity. Yeah. So two important things here is messages of statement and solidarity, resonating with people around the world. Yeah, the intersection of art and activism has always existed. So through protest art to share messages of hope, or through graffiti on street art. Yeah, we don't really see much graffiti in Kuala Lumpur, but if you go to Europe, I think the most graffiti that I have ever seen in my life through my travels in Europe is in Eastern Europe. They actually dedicate the whole wall outside of the city just for graffiti. And they are so interesting to look at. I provide you here the website that I have taken this statement. Next. Okay, so here is the meaning of activism. Yeah, so I will not use the word resistance. I will not use the words protest, but I will use the words activism, and I will tell you why I prefer activism rather than protest. And also resistance is not only because it is a kind of non-violent movement, but it's also very capturing in so many different ways. Yeah, so activism is always about the challenge of changing power relations. So there are countless ways of engaging in activism and being an activist. But the goal of activism is action in order to create an effect. Of course, protests and also resistance, it has greater impact because it's real, it's out there, and you can be directly involved with it, and journalists can actually be directly involved and also to report what's going on there and then. Yeah, but it's different with art and activism. So art, on the other hand, is quite broad. So it's very hard to describe, like in terms of many physical and emotional forms. If I would compare art activism to the street protests, I would feel very emotional in then and there when I join a protest. But with art activism, it's going on the whole time, you know. So, but the goal of art has always been to evoke a certain meaning or feeling by the viewer or participant. It makes you think in much longer time. It lets you to dissolve what you see, you interpret. It might be the same interpretation as the others, but at least there is a kind of accumulative interpretations that basically journalists can come and ask each one of these people, what do they think about the way certain event has been portrayed or presented. Yeah. Okay, so it combines the creative skills of arts to emotionally connect us to a form of activism, where the goal is some sort of social change. So, because in Hooi was speaking about emotion and also psychology, of course, during protests on the street, we have that kind of blood pumping emotions and all these kind of things. In my younger days, I used to join blockades with the Penang. I was in my first year, second year. So it was deep in the forest. There's no journalists. Okay, so all we could do is to defend what we believe need to be defended. I remember it was in it's a long time ago, 1992 during semester break. It was in Ulu Baram in Sarawak. And group of Penan, Kenya, and also the Kayan people, they wanted to go against this group of vloggers. One of the first group of vloggers, I don't want to mention the name here, but I think everybody knows. So we actually erected human barrier. It's so heart pumping. It's like, you know, it's kind of when you do bungee jumping or you jump from the plane. I don't know if any one of you has done that, you know, that kind of adrenaline that you have, and anything can happen at the time. And you see the bulldozers are coming, you know, like it was my first time. The Penan looks really cool. They just do their hands like that. But I was like, okay, is it going to stop in front of me? You know, that kind of feeling. So it's really scary. And that's the whole reason why it was my first and the last. And I would prefer just the one who take pictures, and also to help my friend who is a journalist to write about it. Yeah. And I just do behind the scene kind of things, but it's really scary. And to be honest, I have not joined any Bersih movement because I'm just scared. I'm just scared, but I do something else. It doesn't mean that I'm not supporting activism, but I'm doing something else other than just go to the street. Okay, next. Okay, I would like to acknowledge Professor Farid Alatas, because yesterday he was giving a seminar on theory and literature review. So he put up these two paintings here. So I put it under interpretations because he was talking about theory. But what I would like to highlight here is that how an event has been interpreted differently. I will explain to you why I did that. Okay, so the first one is hang on, I just want to look for my note because I don't really remember the whole story. Okay, so it is actually the earliest portrayal of art activism, I would call it, interpreting events to show power relations and story from the other side. This painting is actually about Diponegoro, or in the first painting is a Pangeran Diponegoro, yeah, a descendant of sultans of Yogyakarta, was passed over several times for ascension to the throne. So in 1825, after declaring himself Ratu Adil and his enemies infidels for their lax practice of Islam, he began a war against the reigning of Sultan and the Dutch colonial government. So in the 5-year struggle that followed, which was waged over much of Central Java, yeah, over 200,000 Javanese and 15,000 Dutch soldiers were killed. So on March 28, 1830, yeah, with most other guerrilla leaders captured, Diponegoro was invited to come to Lieutenant General de Kock's home in Magelang to negotiate and to end the hostilities and guaranteed safety of the passage. But after 3 hours, he was arrested. He was exiled to Makassar, Sulawesi, where he remained until his death. Okay, so the first painting, it was from Raden Saleh, and Saleh's depiction is not the only painted version of Diponegoro's sculpture. You have the second painting. It was by a Dutch painter called Nicholas Pinaman. Yeah, so the earlier version by the Dutch painter, yeah, it was completed in 1835, and it shows rather than an angry, defiant man. Pinaman presented a submissive and beaten Diponegoro, okay, standing lower than his captor and symbolically having less power. Okay, so, but if you look at the other picture, the other painting, yeah, it is totally different. Prince Diponegoro stands defiant in front of that Dutch man, yeah, in front of the colonial officers mentioned. So he appears to be struggling to control his anger, as would be expected from Javanese gentry, yeah. And if you look at the face of the Dutchman, his eyes are static and avoid the eyes of the others. Okay, so these are different interpretations of two different scenes. So I guess it would apply in journalism as well. Like each journalist will report different things, but what most important is what that you are going to report. Are you going to just observe, or are you going to speak to the people who are really involved in that situation? Yeah. So, okay, move on. Okay, so these are the interesting websites that you can actually look at activism and also the history of activism, which I will not share, but you can just click on there and then you can do follow later. Next. Okay, so now I just want to share with you, before I share this one, I would like to bring your attention to an event happened in France a few years ago, if you remember. Sometimes in November 2011, the newspaper office in the 20th arrondissement in Paris was firebombed and its website was hacked. Okay, does anyone recall that? The attacks were presumed to be linked to its decision to rename the edition of the 3rd November 2011 Charlie Hebdo. If you recognize the name Charlie Hebdo, yeah, okay, it's a very historical event for France because it is something related to the freedom of speech, yeah, and I do believe that in our country we do not have that such opportunity and privilege. Okay, so in that situation, yeah, Charlie Hebdo with Muhammad listed as the editor-in-chief. Okay, so the cover featuring a cartoon of Muhammad saying 100 lashes of the whip if you don't die laughing. Yeah, it sounds funny. It's very like direct. If you are a French person, you would just laugh. I was in France when that happened. I wasn't laughing because I know it's going to touch the very core of the Muslim people, especially the extremists. Yeah. Okay. So, and because of that, yeah, a lot of things have happened. But the Sharia Hebdo issue has been a response to recent post-election introduction of Sharia law in Libya and the victory of the Islamist Party in Tunisia. Okay, so basically it was just trying to convey the message about the oppressions of women under Sharia, taking aim at domestic violence, mandatory veiling, burqas, restriction on freedom, forced marriage, stoning of those accused of adultery, and so on, so on, so on, including polygamy, flogging, stoning, gays and lesbian, forced marriage, and a lot of other things. Even though the message was very clear, but because it's a bit satirical, it stirs up the whole world of Islamic world. Yeah. So of course it ended up in bombing and everything. And then 2015, for example, they were making fun of, I can't say they were making fun because the message is really to give awareness and also to speak about something that other people might not want to speak about, you know. So, and because of that, they were shooting, bombing, and then finally some of them died. Yeah. So the website Charlie Hebdo went offline shortly after the shooting. And when it returned, it bore the legend, Je suis Charlie, meaning that I am Charlie. So I also had the t-shirt, I am Charlie, Je suis Charlie. So everybody who actually on the side of this event, they all wear Je suis Charlie on certain days. Yeah. Okay, so now back to Malaysia. We have Zunar. What happened to Zunar? How many times Zunar get arrested, being called to the police station? And his cartoon is not even as aggressive as satirical Charlie Hebdo. So that is how much freedom of speech, non-freedom of speech that we have in Malaysia. Okay. And just recently again, he was called by the Kedah state government because he did a cartoon which lampooned the Kedah state government's decision to cancel the Thai Pusang public holiday, which was published on Facebook on January 23rd. Yeah, I think it was reported by a Malaysia Kini journalist, Ko Junlin. Yeah. Actually, Malaysia Kini is my favorite news. I even subscribe because I feel that you can only find the real news on Malaysia Kini. I mean, no hard feelings for other media, but I do feel that this is the best platform. And the other one is Sarawak Report. And of course, you know what happened to Sarawak Report with Mrs. Brown's stories and cases, you know. So, and there's another type of activism, which I like very much, is through Freedom Film Fest, which is also in Malaysia. And the most powerful one, which I still remember until today, was the one from Agnes Padan. If you remember, if you did attend that, it was speaking about, you know, her determination to ensure that rural communities in Sarawak to have the right to proper healthcare and equal access to amenities. I mean, just imagine in this century, we do still have people in Sarawak who die because of childbirth. Why? Because there's no access to healthcare, there's no access to hospitals, to clinics. It's too far. You know, even if you have a clinic nearby, but there's only normal people. It's just a dresser. We call it staff. And every time you get sick, whether you have stomach ache, headache, or diarrhea, or whatever, they'll only prescribe you Panadol. Yeah. So she was trying to advocate this. And I'm surprised that journalists did not do detailed interview with her about the real situations happening in Sarawak. So it was a bit disappointing, but it was good to watch the documentary. Yeah. Okay. Can we look at slide 6? This is slide 6. Okay, sorry. Go back to James Scott. The previous slide. No, the previous slide. Yes, Art of Resistance. Sorry, Adib, it's so confusing. Okay, so we go to Art Resistance, James Scott. Okay, so I highlight the quote I have from James Scott. It said, most of the political life of subordinate groups is to be found neither in the overt collective defiance of power holders, nor in complete hegemonic compliance, but in the vast territory between these two polar opposites. Okay, James Scott is my favorite author. I read both books. I was forced to read these books when I did anthropology in UKM, but I found it really good that I read it again and again. Why? Because he basically he studies the effects of green revolution in rural Malaysia. So one of the main objectives of the study is to make an argument that the Marxian and Gramscian ideas of false consciousness and hegemony are incorrect. Okay, so why do I highlight weapons of the week? Yeah? So art activism occurs in everyday life, and art activism is the political life and movement of the subordinate groups. And James Scott basically speak about the Orang Asli. Yeah, and that's the whole reason why I chose the case study of Orang Asli today. So as James Scott noted, yes, he said that he basically provides another perspective on hegemony and invisible power that has been both influential and also controversial. So in his book, Weapons of the Weak, Everyday Forms of Resistance, he basically introduced the idea that oppression and resistance are in constant flux, and that by focusing on visible historic events, such as organized rebellions or collective action, we can easily miss subtle but powerful forms of everyday resistance. So being a journalist, maybe you can relate to what I was saying. Yeah. So he basically looked at the peasant and slave societies and their ways of responding to domination. Okay, so imagine the Orang Asli land rights issues with state government. Okay, so he basically look at how do you call that? He focused not on observable acts, which is very obvious, right? We always report on the very obvious non-observable acts. But he insisted that if you would really like to see how non-violent resistance take place, you have to observe the non-observable acts of rebellion, on forms of cultural resistance and non-cooperation that are employed over time through the course of persistent servitude. So reporting is not just about, I'm not a journalist, I'm not a reporter, but it is based on research experience. You cannot make a conclusion or to write something just then and there. It's always like you need to go back again and again and again. I mean, at least that's what I do when I do my research. So, however, what interests me more is what he studied, the actions that the indigenous people studied. So his research finds that overt peasant rebellions are actually rather uncommon. So it does not occur when and where expected, and often don't have much impact. Rather than seeing resistance as organization, he actually looked at less visible everyday forms of resistance, such as foot dragging, evasion, false compliance, pilfering, feigned ignorance, slander, and sabotage. So he finds this in rural and factory settings, and also among the middle class and elite, for example, especially with through tax evasion or conscriptions. But particularly among the rural people who are physically dispersed and less politically organized than urban populations. So, and he also looked at closely linked to the idea of resistance, where his notion of transcript, hidden and public, which are established ways of behaving and speaking that fit particular actors in particular social settings, whether dominant or oppressed. So therefore, what he says was resistance is a subtle form of contesting public transcript by making use of prescribed roles and language to resist the abuse of power, including things like rumor, gossip, disguise, linguistic tricks, metaphor, euphemisms, folktales, ritual, gesture, and anonymity. So you can actually find that on page 137 if you read the book. So these methods are particularly effective in situations where violence is used to maintain the status quo, allowing a veiled discourse of dignity and self-assertion within the public transcript. So in which ideological resistance is disguised, muted, and veiled for safety's sake. So non-violent, safety, everybody can go home peacefully. So these forms of resistance require little coordination or planning, and are used by both individuals and groups to resist without directly confronting or challenging elite norms. Okay, so this is really, really important when one would like to look at the resistance or art activism of indigenous people. In Malaysia, particularly the Orang Asli and also the Penan, and now come the Kayan, Kenyah, the Iban, talking about land rights, how their land has been taken by Old Palm, for example. Okay, next. Now I'm going to zoom into a more specific topic where art activism has been used effectively to convey the message of the Orang Asli to various state government. Okay. Before that, I would just like to bring your attention to a few situations of the Orang Asli in Malaysia, in case some of you do not know. So Orang Asli is a legal term under Act 134 that address more than 39 different groups. Specifically, there's 3 different big groups of Orang Asli as Orang Asli. So you don't actually translate the term Orang Asli to indigenous people because the term itself is a legal term. It's their name. Okay, so it means just the original people. So orang asli, they have resist, they have protests, they involved in Bersih, they have put up barrier blockades at the borders of their land with state land. They have their social movement as well, like Jaringan Kampung Orang Asli Malaysia, which is actually founded by an Orang Asli woman called Tija. Okay? So they have done a lot of things, but a lot of things that they have done are silent. They don't really put it out there in order for the public to know. Okay, so these are very interesting things that should be published, because it's something that without the motivations of strong, powerful NGOs or individuals, it's really coming from the community itself. What lacking in our Malaysian journalism is that the community voice is very small. We always, in the report that I read, there's a lot of news that I read news every day, including Malaysia Kini as well. Sometimes it's just highlighting the events, but there is no community voice. There's no visible community voice to really speak about the situation. It does not engage emotionally. It's like when you read the news, you just read the news and then tomorrow you forget, It does not leave that kind of impact. I would really like to read a news about certain events that make me cheer up or make me wouldn't be able to sleep at night. So that is the kind of journalism that is not yet there in our country, I feel. I mean, this is just my criticism. I hope no hard feelings here. Okay, so there are a few situations that Orang Asli are facing. Like it has been reported that there are actually like the Orang Asli community who live in Hutan Simpan, Kuala Langat Utara, Forest Reserve, for example. Just recently, they were traveled there. 250 individuals from 12 different villages actually went to see the Selangor Menteri Besar, and then would reconsider the proposal of degazetting as the forest as a bequest from the ancestors. And then you have the 2 blockades that were erected by the Orang Asli in the Chunek village in Perak, beginning of the year, for example. And then you have the Temia Orang Asli of Guamusang, Kelantan. And then in 2019, a very big event. I think it was covered quite nicely. Attended by 1,000 Orang Asli leaders and advocates for the National Orang Asli Convention, with the Ministry of Rural Development, and 136 resolutions was covering different aspects of Orang Asli lives, and then promising change by the speech of Dr. Mahathir at the time about acknowledging principle of free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, to ensure that every planned development and welfare program will benefit the community by not sidelining their interests. And of course, this year, you have 40 Penans from Sarawak, for example, still having this kind of problem. Different type of protests. But what I feel that really effective is a protest like you see on the slide there. This kind of art activism, and the artist, temuan artist Zakiah Koya, so he did this. He's a very close friend of mine. So he used to exhibit his art, which exclusively features Orang Asli folk and various aspects of their life. Okay, so he basically believed that in combining art and activism, and that's why he will not keep silent when his own village is under threat. So he was one of the individual who lead his whole village in protesting silently. They were putting up like signage on the tree, on the Instagram. Everybody was doing something and write something, put on the Instagram. Like I think Zakiah was mentioning about how social media is very effective in to bring mass protests mass resistance. So it really works thanks to this digital platform. Yeah. So, and okay, can we go to the next slide? Okay. So this is how he conveyed the message about loss of land, about taking of land and abuse of land rights of the orang asli. This image is very powerful. The first time I saw this image, I was like, wow, this is very, very powerful. With the clouds, with the black palm oil, and there is no green at all left. It really shows how palm oil kill our land, how palm oil kill the orang asli land. And with the traditional clothes, he just looked at that. And to my mind, when I see this, I feel like crying actually the first time I saw this. Yeah, it really touched your emotion, you know, like the sadness. Okay, but unfortunately, when this painting was published in the newspaper, they were just talking about Shah. They were not talking about the message that he was trying to convey through his painting. And that was very disappointing. And he himself was saying the same. He said, I'm trying to use media to convey my message. I'm not a journalist. I can only paint, but hopefully that somebody will publish what I see, what I think about my painting, through my painting. You know, he even put confession of oil palm. You know exactly what's going on. So it would be nice if there is, every time there is issue about palm oil, you just put this image, you just put another image, you know, and you speak about what was going on. It will totally capture the public audience. Yeah, next. Okay. So this is another painting of his. When I first saw this, I did not actually see the gray part of the painting. I was focusing on the lady and I saw green. After I look at that lady, only then I realized there is actually two different phases of landscape in this painting. And this painting was hanging at the research center from 2018 until 2020. A lot of students came to the research center. The first thing they saw was, they said, Doctor, this painting is very powerful because it shows the change. It shows the negative impact of development. You know, students can actually see, and it's very, very strong. And I was supposed to teach a course called Sustainable Development. And it get them to think about, okay, sustainable development. Is development really sustainable? You know, so finally, I have to change the course, sustainable versus development, because development does not mean progress. So this painting actually changed the whole course and changed the perspective of my students when they think about progress because of projects, because of top-bottom development towards the indigenous people and also towards any other who has been affected. Yeah. Okay, but again, it was never reported that way. This picture came out many times in the newspaper. Next. Now, Zakiah Koya does not only advocate on ecosystem, palm oil, land rights, but he also advocates on art itself. Yeah. So he used to use canvas and do a lot of his own technique. But finally, a few years ago, he started to paint on tikar mangkuang, woven mat. And then I asked him, I said, why do you use tikar mangkuang? He was saying, we all know that tikar mangkuang is used on the floor. And the floor is always the lowest level and rank because we step on it. So he said, I just want to put tikar mangkuang as something that can be appreciated as art instead just putting it on the floor. And therefore, I paint on it. So each of the tikan mangkuang that he used to paint, he never put it on the floor. Of course, because nicely painted, you put it in the frame. So he changed totally the perceptions of the tikan mangkuang. Okay. But what reported is only reported that new technique of sharp look drawing on the woven mat, but no one ever asked what is the significance of painting on the woven mat. See, these are the aspects that we always leave out. Yeah, and then he only paints ladies who actually weave the mat, and I was asking him to paint me on the mat, and he just casually said, if you weave your mat, then I will paint you on your mat, you know, but that's never going to happen. Yeah, so he is advocating not just for the ecosystem, environment, but also the product that comes out in the environment in order to make people to know that these are all coming from the environment, that it has to be appreciated by putting the faces that he loves. Yeah. Okay, next. I have a lot to share, but I think I will need to be very fast. How much time I have? Okay, so this one is very interesting as well. Okay, 10 minutes. He basically drew this old guy here, as you can see. And this old guy is the community leader who joined with him to lead his village people and other villages to go for protests. They even went to Bersih, you know. So in order to honor him and to speak to the world that this man is very important, the most progressive Orang Asli leader, he painted him on the mat that his wife woven and has brought this painting everywhere in his exhibition by speaking about his involvement, his role, his important role as the headman to bring the community to be aware of their rights. Okay, next. Yeah, okay. This is a very sentimental story for me. I am an activist too. That's the reason why I use art activism. So here, I'm using art activist to do my activism. And I was heading Center for Malaysian Indigenous Studies. And the purpose of me doing this, because I want to show to Universiti Malaya that, look, Indigenous people in this higher institution is very significant. Why there is no division of Indigenous studies? Why Indigenous courses are not offered? Why Indigenous culture have not been introduced in this university? We have a huge numbers of faculties, not even a single one has Indigenous studies. So I asked Shah to draw in this double-story building. Next, Adib, I just want to show you the pictures. Next. Yes, okay. So there's another one that he painted. The Orang Asli boy. And that Orang Asli boy painting was actually sponsored by Education New Zealand. And New Zealand High Commissioner even came to officiate that painting and have a small ceremony. And at the bottom, I was asking Brendan Scott to draw the master weaver that I have worked with, because she has been awarded as the master weaver of UNESCO, but nobody ever give her recognition. So my way to give recognition is by collaborating with Shah and also Brendan to put these faces. But what I didn't know is that Universiti Malaya doesn't allow faces. And at one point, I was actually asked to paint over this mural. But as an act of protest, I refused. So I just refused to answer the email, basically. So the mural painting is still there, but I'm out of the center. But at least it's still standing there. So please go and take pictures and and please tell our stories, because this is the only place at public university you can see the faces of indigenous people. Okay, next. That's the Center for Malaysian Indigenous Studies. Those are those beautiful murals. And some people complain saying that these faces looking so scary. But international students would go there and take pictures and say, this is beautiful. It strongly advocate the indigenous people. So we have two different kind of, local versus foreign ideas. Okay, next. Next, okay. So that's me standing there. Hang on, not yet. That's me standing there just to show that this is my space and I have the right to be there and I have the right to defend that building, but I am no longer be able to be there. And this is the pictures with the New Zealand High Commissioner proudly officiated that face there. Okay, next. Okay, I don't think we have much time, but Leni Magno, what interesting about her, she's also Temuan, she's a contemporary artist. I would like you okay, I would like you to look into her YouTube videos, how she draws. So it's all about her drawings. But if you realize, there's an orange flower here. Next. There's another type of flower. There's another type of flower. Next. There's all with flowers. I asked people, did they notice the flowers? They said, oh, we just look at how she drew. We just asked her, what is her vision, her mission, but no one ever asked why different flowers and what does each flower symbolize. She was trying to convey her cultural heritage. The meaning of the flowers actually means something, but nobody has ever asked. But I asked her personally. Yeah, okay, next. Okay, so I just want to conclude here. So as you can see there, various art activism, so communicating new perspective, questioning the status quo, speaking out about belief and inspiring others to take action, art and activism often share some of the same underlying motivation. So it's just that it's like the painting of Diponegoro. You just have to look at many different angles. Yeah. Sometimes we tend to see just one way street. We seldom do a U-turn and go the same way, So it's good to get lost sometimes. You do U-turn and you revisit the space. Okay, do I have next slide? I don't even remember. Okay, so okay, so this is the political world is a cultural world. So everyday act of resistance is actually everyday lifestyles. I mean, even you have your act of activism. Each day what we do to prove our points, it is an art of activism. Okay, I will stop here. Yeah, this kind of thing you can talk until the cows come home. So.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Welyne. It's very, very, what I call engaging to see such passion among academics, especially, especially when we're talking about issues which are not always played openly in the mass media. And as you said, art is resistance. I mean, art from those days in the caves, it came from resistance. It's because someone told them not to write on the walls, and they did write on the walls. So we have in other countries cartoons, satires. They are big in Southeast Asia, where many a time we are told not to express our feelings, not to express what we are supposed to be polite. We are supposed to be polite people. Satire is one way of saying things, and getting our message across. In Malaysia, I think we have Fahmi Reza, who's very good at penning, the current issues. And then we used to have Lat, although he drew for a very, very pro, government newspaper in those days, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s. Lat was the face of Malaysian cartoonists penning politicians, one of them. Many people don't realize this, but I think he was one of our first to actually poke fun at our politicians. But we also have, on the other hand, the local cartoonists, in Thailand, in in Philippines, in Vietnam, in Cambodia. They are very, very, very active in their own local language, because some things can only be understood by the locals themselves. Foreigners might not understand. For example, a Thai saying a certain word may be different. The meaning might take on a different note as compared to Malaysians. We are very good at having double meaning with our words, with our arts, with our cartoons. People might think it's nothing. We have a version of the Mad magazine, Gila Gila.
Yeah.
And although people think there is nothing sinister in it, but I think a lot of politicians, of our leaders, actually grew up reading that and become politically inclined. Mad itself is a cartoon which is very politically, in satire. So then we have, it's interesting to see that you also brought about how reporters should be writing, should be questioning. And I think what you meant was this: humanize the stories, touch the readers. And many of us are just reporters. At the end of the day, a lot of us are not fit to use the word journalist for ourselves. Myself, I'm ashamed to use the word journalist, because journalists are a high-ranking term for a reporter that does more than just report. And many times we are mere reporters. So I think when you said engage, humanize, for example, bring in the people factor. So that is interesting. I hope we get some ideas from that. I definitely got a lot of ideas from that. Well, we'll move on. We are short of. We have we are running out of time, and then we have our final speaker for the day is Dr. Eduardo C. Tadem, who is a professional lecturer from the of Asian Studies from the Asian Center, University of the Philippines, Diliman. And Dr. Eduardo is he's got a very long list of CV. So he is the co-chair. He is the let me read this again. The convener of the Program on Alternative Development, University of the Philippines Center for Integrative and Development Studies, UPCIDS AltDev. Is that it, Doctor? I'm not sure I've said it correctly. He is co-chair of the Asian Regional Exchange for New Alternatives, ARENA, and a founding governing board member of the Consortium of Southeast Asian Studies in Asia, Southeast Asia. He has 142 publications in books, academic journals, and periodicals on the political economy of foreign aid, Southeast Asian regional integration, civil society, peasant society, agrarian reform and rural development, civil society, industry studies, Mindanao regional development, rural unrest and social movements, Philippine-Japan relations, conflicts over natural resources, international labor migration, foreign investments, special economic zones, and contemporary politics. So with such a CV, I think we have a very important person who will be presenting his speech, not speech, his lecture on Southeast Asian civil society engagement with the ASEAN process, challenges and alternatives. You have 30 minutes, Doctor, please.
Thank you very much, Zakiah, and thank you very much to the Kiniacademy for inviting me for this Masterclass 7 under the SEAFORE program. It's an honor to be here and such a distinguished company of scholars and activists. So let me begin by sharing my screen. Okay, just as an introduction, let me just state that the perceived inability of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, to meaningfully address the issues and concerns of Southeast Asian peoples is viewed by the ASEAN Civil Society Conference, ASEAN People's Forum, or ACSEAPF, as rooted in ASEAN's being locked in a market-centered and state-supported process that was conceived by regional and national elites to perpetuate control over the region's natural resources and productive capacities. Civil society sees ASEAN leaders making decisions without the meaningful participation of marginalized and disenfranchised peoples of the region, and are accountable only to narrow vested interests of economic elites and political oligarchies. This has only further widened the gap between rich and poor within and among countries and caused unparalleled debasement of the environment. ACSEAPF believes that ASEAN's continued adherence to a neoliberal model of development prioritizes corporate interests and elite groups over the interests of Southeast Asian peoples. Now, ACSEAPF has been engaging with the ASEAN process since 2005. But an in-house assessment or evaluation by the Civil Society Network says that 10 years of engagement with the official ASEAN process from 2005 to 2015 has been consistently characterized by a prevailing silence and lack of attention and response to the observations and recommendations raised in all previous ACSEAPF statements. As a result, some civil society groups recommend a radical restructuring of civil society engagements with Southeast Asian states by crafting a new People's Regional Integration Order in order to implement an agenda independent of the state and the corporate-biased ASEAN process. Now, just a brief background on ASEAN. As you all know, it was established in August 1967 with 5 countries. But later on, Brunei joined in 1984, Vietnam in 1995, Lao PDR, and Myanmar or Burma in 1997, and finally Cambodia in 1999, making up what is today the 10 member states of ASEAN. And as has been pointed out by previous speakers, Timor-Leste has been applying to join ASEAN for several years now, but has simply been put on an observer status. Actually, the other country in Southeast Asia that is on observer status is Papua New Guinea. So in effect, you actually have 12 Southeast Asian countries who are supposed to be part of ASEAN but are not. Just to go through the aims very quickly of ASEAN, you have accelerate economic growth, social progress, cultural development, promote regional peace and stability, promote active collaboration and mutual assistance on matters of common interest, provide assistance to each other in the form of training and research, collaborate more effectively to encourage further growth in agriculture, industry, and trade sectors. In other words, the entire economy of Southeast Asia, promote Southeast Asian studies, and finally maintain close and beneficial cooperation with existing international and regional organizations. Now, these are the principles that guide ASEAN, and as a result of a treaty entered in 1976, you have mutual respect for independence, sovereignty, equality, territorial integrity, and national identity of all nations, the right of every state to lead its national existence free from interference from any other member countries or subversion or any coercion, non-interference in the internal affairs of one another, settlement of differences or disputes peacefully, renunciating the threat or use of force, and effective cooperation among themselves. Later on, we'll see that some of these principles have created problems in terms of addressing issues that affect peoples of Southeast Asia, including, for example, human rights, democracy, rise of authoritarianism, and others. Now, the main forum for CSO engagement with ASEAN is the ASEAN Civil Society Conference ASEAN People's Forum, ACSC-APF. This was formed in 2005, and it is a network of Southeast Asian civil society organizations and social movements to bring attention to the issues and concerns of its constituencies. That is, the working class, the peasantry, urban poor, fisherfolk, women, children, LGBTQIA+ community, indigenous peoples, older persons, ordinary rank and file employees, professionals, students, persons with disabilities, and migrants. In engaging with ASEAN, the CSO network has focused on organizing national consultations, dialogues with government counterparts, regional consultative meetings, crafting the annual ACSC-APF statement, holding a parallel conference with the ASEAN Summit, mass mobilizations, and an interface with ASEAN leaders. It has been the hope of the network that the engagement process will result in meaningful and substantial dialogues with government leaders and decision makers, and lead to basic and essential reforms and changes in ASEAN. Unfortunately, there has hardly been any progress in making ASEAN recognize civil society's legitimate concerns, let alone seriously implement a range of proposals presented at the annual summits of ASEAN heads of state. Indeed, the attitude shown by ASEAN in its dealings with civil society groups can be best described as tokenism. It has thus been a frustrating and unproductive 16 years of ACSC-APF engagement with ASEAN. An internal ACSC-APF 10-year review, 2005 to 2015, concludes that, and I quote, ASEAN and its member governments have been seen to be more comfortable with the private sector and academic and research think tanks than with civil society, unquote. And that, quote, individual ASEAN member countries have consistently resisted and vacillated with regard to civil society participation and engagement. In various statements issued since 2015, all the way to just this year, 2021, ACSC-APF has repeatedly expressed frustration over the lack of attention to civil society concerns. For example, in 2016, the Timor-Leste statement says that ASEAN civil society remained extremely concerned about ASEAN's prevailing silence and lack of attention and response to the observations and recommendations raised in all previous ACSC-APF statements. In 2015 and 2017 statements, these were in Kuala Lumpur as well as in Quezon City, Philippines, respectively. The network criticized the development paradigm of ASEAN member states, which it claims, and I quote, has only bred greater inequalities, accelerated marginalization and exploitation, inhibit peace, democracy, and social progress, spawned economic, social, and environmental crisis, extensive human rights violations, situations of conflict and violence, and wanton exploitation of natural resources that are all overwhelming the region's ecosystems. In 2019, the ACSC-APF also noted that CSOs and people's movements have argued that the changes in ASEAN's perspectives or the announced changes in ASEAN's perspectives and its pronounced tilt towards prioritizing Southeast Asian people's welfare have been more rhetorical than real. Meaningful people's participation in government programs, projects, and decisions are nowhere to be found. Indeed, ASEAN is seen by independent observers as working to preserve and expand the role of traditional political oligarchies and economic corporate elites. The same sentiments were raised in the 2020 ACSE statement in Vietnam, and lastly in the 2021 gathering just this year in October, which was held online, where it was stated that the network found the common features of repression, exploitation, and control mechanisms that operate in Southeast Asia during the COVID-19 pandemic, and shows that the people of Southeast Asia shared common situations and concerns about exploitation and domination by national elites, oligarchs, and ruling economic classes that strengthens authoritarian power of the state. To summarize ACSE APF's concerns, you have here the lack of popular participation, rising inequalities, weakening democracies, human rights deficits, elite-centered development policies, the lack of a regional and unifying identity, weak social protection, and gender inequalities. ASEAN's rhetoric of being people-oriented and people-centered, which they actually pronounced as early as 2007, is not matched by its actions and attitude vis-a-vis civil society and social movements and marginalized peoples of Southeast Asia in general. ASEAN's patronizing and condescending attitude towards CSOs is reflected in how the body officially characterizes CSOs. The 2012 ASEAN Guidelines on Accreditation for Civil Society Organizations define a CSO as, and I quote, a non-profit organization of ASEAN entities, natural or juridical, that promotes, strengthens, and helps realize the aims and objectives of the ASEAN community and its three pillars. Similarly, the guidelines issued in February 2015 by the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, or ICHR, define CSOs as association of persons, natural or juridical, that is non-profit, non-governmental in nature, which are organized voluntarily to promote, strengthen, and help realize the aims and objectives of ASEAN activities. ASEAN encourages CSOs to seek accreditation with it in order to be granted, quote, the opportunity and privilege of participating in ASEAN activities, unquote. Notice here ASEAN's patronizing tone in refusing to recognize CSO participation as a right, only a privilege and opportunity. Approval of accreditation, however, and I quote, shall be based primarily upon the assessment of the positive contribution which such a CSO could make to the enhancement, strengthening, and realization of the aims and objectives of ASEAN, and that the objectives of the CSO's activities should be consistent with the aims and objectives of ASEAN. In other words, CSOs are expected to merely adhere and follow ASEAN's aims and objectives. Obviously, the ASEAN definition of and attitude towards CSOs are self-serving and run counter to internationally accepted definitions and status of CSOs as independent and autonomous players who have their own vision and goals that may not necessarily coincide with state and official government vision and policies. As the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, as well as the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, pointed out, and I quote, CSOs are voluntary organizations with governance and direction coming from citizens or constituency members without significant government-controlled participation or representation. Even as the ASEAN-APF continues to express its dismay over ASEAN's track record vis-a-vis its peoples, it is also somehow hampered by an apparent misunderstanding and confusion about the real nature of the ASEAN project. In a 2016 press release, the organization appears to plead for ASEAN governments to recognize civil society, quote, not as a threat, but as an important ally in ensuring the realization of human rights for all ASEAN citizens. This equivocal attitude, to my mind, is further reflected in the following statements incorporated in the 2016 ASEAN-APF statement, and I quote, "We reaffirm our commitments to monitor and engage in the ASEAN processes towards a people-centric ASEAN as member states continue to aspire for political cohesiveness, economic integration, and in maintaining a socially responsible, people-oriented, and rules-based ASEAN." This apparent ambivalence of ASEAN-APF towards ASEAN actually reflects contrasting attitudes and a lack of consensus among the various groups within the network. Some groups see no other recourse but to continue the engagement with ASEAN, following the same processes and activities that they have been doing in the past, despite the lack of meaningful results. Others, on the other hand, feel that continued engagement is futile and a waste of time and resources. In succeeding ASEAN-APF gatherings, however, the push for an alternative regional process would gain momentum even as engagement remained on the agenda. Since the 2017 Assembly in the Philippines, in Quezon City, the ASEAN-APF has moved towards acknowledging the need for an alternative form of engagement with ASEAN and also for an entirely new regionalism process, sounding the alarm for the shrinking space for civil society to effectively shape the agenda and policies of ASEAN and the respective governments. The 2017 ASEAN-APF statement resolved to, and I quote, "Develop and adopt a new vision for engagement by civil society with ASEAN based on greater people-to-people interactions that will establish, expand, and strengthen a new people's regional integration process based on the alternative practices of peoples, networks, and organizations across the region's societies." To highlight the importance of developing a Southeast Asian people's alternative regional integration, in 2019, the ASEAN-APF, in its statement, identifies the following task to be undertaken by the regional CSO network, and I quote, "Given that years of ASEAN-APF engagement with the official ASEAN process have been met with lack of attention to the recommendations raised, resulting in minimal outcomes in the substantive improvement in the lives of our peoples, to undertake a process for an alternative people's regional integration based on the alternative practices of communities, sectors, and networks." The movement for an alternative Southeast Asian regional integration took shape in the latter half of 2017. At the University of the Philippines Center for Integrative and Development Studies, a program on alternative development was established by scholar activists who have been part of previous ASEAN-APF gatherings. AltDev's main objective was to look at alternative paradigms, policies, practices, and projects that have been largely marginalized and excluded from the mainstream, and to bring these alternatives out of the margins and into the mainstream in order to level the playing field. The starting point for developing a people's regionalism was to acknowledge that Southeast Asian peoples and communities have, for many years and on their own, been engaged in alternative, heterodox, and non-mainstream practices that encompass economic, political, and social-cultural aspects. People-to-people interactions and networks have been set up. These alternative practices and interactions are seen as the building blocks for an alternative model of regionalism. In addition, popular practices also constitute a rich trove of empirical data that need to be distilled, subjected to the rigorous test of comparisons, and finally conceptualized and developed into a new paradigm, a narrative, a framework, a theory, or a guide to action. Economic alternative practices constitute on the production side, these are examples, social enterprises, producer cooperatives, and communities engaging in exchanges on the technologies of food production systems that are environmentally friendly and sustainable. So examples are organic family farming, agroecology and biodiversity, zero waste production, and indigenous agronomic practices. In the marketing aspect, direct consumer producer linkages via the media of alter trade organizations and producer and trading cooperatives. In financing, there are credit cooperatives and alternative currency systems. In the power sector, bright prospects exist for community-based renewable energy systems, such as solar, wind, and biogas technologies. Political alternative practices, you have informal and formal networks of civil society organizations and social movements that have been operating for decades. Joint political advocacies and corresponding actions have been undertaken via mass mobilizations during international gatherings, as well as lobbying with states and multilateral organizations. Alternatives to traditional political parties have also emerged, while direct actions are undertaken by people's organizations or spontaneously by marginalized and deprived communities. For example, the unilateral occupation of land and housing projects. Communities have also engaged in integrated regional socioeconomic planning and have practiced age-old conflict settlement mechanisms. In the area of social alternative practices, you have self-help groups, local networks who have coordinated their social protection activities. Examples are community-based health systems, alternative learning practices such as folk schools, non-formal centers, and lifelong learning advocacies, and provisions for a people-oriented shelter program using indigenous designs, technologies, and construction materials. And then lastly, you have your cultural alternative practices, which was highlighted in the previous presentation by Dr. Welyne, which I find very entertaining and illuminating and informative as well. On the cultural aspect, visual artists and other performers have been networking through regional events that showcase the richness, diversity, and historical depth of Southeast Asia's creative arts. More significant, political and economic issues that are the concern of civil society groups, social movements, and marginalized peoples are also highlighted and represented via these cultural interactions and presentations. In 2020, a landmark decision was made during that year's ASEAN People's Forum, which was held in hybrid and blended forms and hosted by Vietnamese civil society organizations. And this is the resolution on alternative regional integration for Southeast Asian peoples, which was approved by the plenary in a gathering. And these are the pertinent sections of that resolution. Southeast Asian peoples' grassroots communities have for many years been engaged in alternative, heterodox, and non-mainstream practices, and that the APF shall adopt a new vision for engagement by civil society with ASEAN based on people-to-people interactions, rather than state-to-state relations or purely market-oriented interactions. And that this new vision shall lead to the establishment of a new people's regional integration process. And furthermore, the new Southeast Asian people's regional integration shall be based on the alternative practices of peoples, networks, and organizations across the region societies. In other words, this would now be a regional integration from below, rather than what ASEAN is, which is a regional integration from above. So in terms of concrete outcomes of this initiative, thus far, what we have accomplished is, number one, the documentation through field research of identified, sorry for that, the documentation through field research of identified case studies of alternative practices in several Southeast Asian countries. Number two, 3 regional conferences in November 2018, October 2019, and November 2021. Most of the participants were practitioners from Southeast Asian grassroots communities and CSOs who are part of the ASEAN-APF network. In these conferences, participants shared their experiences from the documented alternative practices and interacted with each other. The documentation in the 3 conferences has so far produced about 60 cases of alternative practices of a political, social, economic, and cultural nature in Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Timor-Leste, Burma, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and in the Thai-Burma border. The third concrete outcome was a people-to-people exchange activity held on July 21 to 26, about 5 or 6 days, in 2019 in West Java and Jakarta, Indonesia, hosted by the Konfederasi Pergerakan Rakyat Indonesia, or the Confederation of Indonesian People's Movements, KPRI. This was proposed by participants at the November 2018 regional conferences and enabled participant practitioners from different countries to learn from each other as they are oriented on existing alternative community-based practices undertaken by the hosting organization. For future activities moving forward, the following steps have been identified. The conducting of alternative learning and training programs based on grassroots needs, mobilizing the entire universe of alternative practices, regional interactions and communities, and organizing joint actions and initiatives, promoting the replication of the alternative practices in order to mainstream them, establishing a regional mechanism at the civil society level that is based on the interactions and cooperative practices between these alternative practices, and finally, hopefully, and this is the bigger project, I suppose, conceptualizing and making sense of all of these practices and developing new paradigms and strategies of development. So in conclusion, the 16 years of engagement with the official ASEAN process has taught civil society movements in Southeast Asia valuable lessons that should guide its future trajectories. The real challenge facing regional CSO networks like ASEAN-APF today lies beyond the established ASEAN process and should be firmly linked and tightly interconnected with grassroots initiatives and the creative practices of real peoples struggling to carve a better and more dignified future life for their families and communities. In the process of building an alternative regionalism through the documentation of existing practices on the ground and the various regional interactions that have taken place, what surfaces are the principles of solidarity, collectivism, social equality, cooperation, mutual benefit, and the commons. Moreover, the judicious and responsible use of human natural resources and the need for peaceful and harmonious relationship with other peoples and with nature and the environment also figure prominently. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Eduardo. I think we got an overall view of what ASEAN has done and what we are doing and what we should be doing more in the future. There's one question, we'll go straight to the question and answer session. There's one question for Dr. Eduardo, being fresh off from your lecture just now. The ASEAN organization was formed in the midst of Cold War. when leftist movements were often perceived as potentially subversive. Does this history affect ASEAN's approach to civil society movements today? Especially when it inhibits regional integration from below.
Well, I've already outlined the various obstacles and challenges that face ASEAN, Southeast Asian civil society movements with respect to engaging with ASEAN. And yeah, it is true, as the question has been posed, that ASEAN was established during the height of the Cold War, and it was mainly a gathering of 5 anti-communist states. But of course, now it is no longer that. It is now more than just a political organization, which it was originally. You now have an ASEAN Free Trade Association. You now have 4 pillars that they stand on: economic, political, social, cultural. Or rather 3 pillars, sorry. It's just that civil society has been asking ASEAN to form a 4th pillar on the environment, which it has repeatedly refused to consider. So it is now more than just a Cold War type of political organization, since it now includes communist states like Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. And it is now more in line with what we could call the neoliberal paradigm of development, in terms of being market-oriented, free trade-oriented, letting the market decide development in the ASEAN region, and promoting trade and investment within ASEAN, among the different ASEAN members. So that has now been the more overriding concern and an objective of ASEAN. Of course, it still has the political aspect of trying to avoid conflicts, or rather, should I say, trying to sweep conflicts under the rug, because they don't really address conflicts within countries and also between countries. They simply ignore them because of that prevailing principle of non-interference in each other's country's internal activities.
I would also like to ask, we seem to have not touched much in all our presentations on, because ASEAN is supposed to play the unifier role, at the same time take ASEAN countries to the next level. But then we have, like you said, they tend to sweep it under the carpet or wear their blinders. The question is, we have 2 very, very important 2 small countries, not very small, Myanmar is not very small, two countries which are facing, where the people are facing, are trying to, have been in resistance for so long. And now they are wanting to join ASEAN fully as members, but they're not, the people are not getting the support, because the leaders are either, because we have economic ties with Myanmar, or, we have we don't want to, the Asian style of don't want to snub the neighbor, that kind of thing. So Timor-Leste and Myanmar are 2 issues.
Sorry, you mean Timor-Leste and Papua New Guinea?
Papua New Guinea, but Myanmar is already in ASEAN.
Oh yeah.
You remember that when they discussed Myanmar in the last ASEAN talks, it was just touch and go. So a lot of issues were not addressed, and the media did not really get to highlight it in their reports also. So do you think ASEAN will be open to talking about the media, to the media, about this resistance from ASEAN itself against Timor-Leste, from ASEAN itself to accepting Myanmar, whatever the junta is doing?
I seriously doubt whether ASEAN will give due recognition to people's movements, especially the democracy movements in Burma, Myanmar, or for that matter, even in Thailand, because they will see this as interference in the internal affairs of other countries. So they will simply, as they have been in many occasions in the past, will simply turn a blind eye to these gross violations of human rights that are taking place within individual ASEAN member countries, because the prevailing principle really is to respect the national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the internal processes taking place in each country. They may, of course, issue some vague or general statements about promoting democracy and people's will and all that, but beyond that, they do nothing. And they will simply tolerate gross transgressions of human rights that are taking place in individual countries. This whole notion of providing a unified stance, however, sometimes breaks down. For example, in the attitude towards China, for example, ASEAN is not united. There are countries in ASEAN, I'm sure you know which countries they are they lean more towards China, while others, especially those who have territorial disputes with China, are more critical of China and wish China to change its actions, especially in the South China Sea. So there is no unified stand on the part of ASEAN with respect to China or the South China Sea disputes over territorial waters, territorial boundaries. The other issue where ASEAN has failed to take a unified stand or even take unified actions is more telling. And this has to do with the COVID-19 pandemic. There has been no unified, coordinated action on the part of ASEAN states to address the COVID-19 pandemic. There's been no sharing, there's been no cooperation. So it's been like each country each country to its own. There have been meetings, I know, highly publicized meetings of ASEAN leaders online, but they have not come up with any concrete plan or, for that matter, any concrete action in order to address the COVID-19 pandemic as an organization, as a regional organization.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Eduardo. I would like to invite one of the participants, Hong Wan from Vietnam, because we have been talking about all the other countries, and we have someone from Vietnam. We don't really know a lot of this happenings in Vietnam that goes on because most of it are in the local language and very little comes out in English. So Hong Wan, do you think you could tell us what's going on in Vietnam? Is there a big resistance movement happening, or is it just vibrations on the ground?
Thank you very much for touching on me. Honestly, I am quite concerned because this one is recording and live streaming, and the topic is really sensitive in Vietnam. But to about resistance, I think there's a lot of underground thing that happen, I feel. But for example, in practice, the media is not keen to cover for to be safe, and also we receive guidance not to cover, even for example, if there are resistance, like for example, protests in some country in Europe, because they right now, for example, in just for example, like in Austria, there are protests against the COVID-19 mandate vaccine. You know, we not cover that. We don't want to spread the feelings of you know, of that to some Vietnamese people who also not like to have the vaccine. Not to mention, for example, we not cover news about Burma resistant, or we sort of what's the term? You know, civil disobedience, obedience something. So we don't cover that. We don't want to. The guidance that I understand is we don't want to interfere into the sovereignty of Burma country itself. So a lot of things in Thailand, for example, we don't want to cover the protests against the royal family. And for any photo that if we cover for any photo that we use, we are not allowed to use any photo with the sign. Yeah, so there's a lot of things going on, like the requirement for the media and heavy punishment. My newspaper is suspended for 3 months for the daily newspaper. We got to stop for 3 months completely in 2017. So we also have some scare, and you know, we choose to play safe on it. Yeah, I think I can discuss more off the record or more private.
Yeah, I understand, Hong Wan. I just wanted to have you participate a little bit in the class. You know, we are all talking about ourselves. Also, I have a question to pose to Dr. Khoo. What can the media do when they are faced with heavy-handed authorities who act against those who report resistance? I mean, as someone who's not only an academic but also as an activist, what would you advise young reporters or even senior reporters, you know, being out there, knowing that there is freedom of speech, but no freedom after speech? So, Dr. Khoo?
Sure. Thank you, Zakiah. Since I'm not from the media industry, but I would assume the same thing goes for with what happens to academics when we are faced with all these challenges as well. So I will advise that the first thing is, of course, media, you have your unions and associations that you can get the protections. I'm not sure if at the regional level that you have a regional umbrella that protect the reporters. But I think apart from that, the lawyers, I think lawyers from different countries, you have the networks that when to offer assistance, at least in the context of Malaysia, I know there are human rights lawyers that are on standby, and then there are also the unions and the journalists and the media practitioners that could probably lend some assistance. But I can imagine that this form of assistance can be very challenging for some of the other countries in Southeast Asia, in the case of like Myanmar, Cambodia, and things like that. So I do come across that some who get the external assistance. However, I would probably put this forward to the media practitioners to actually form a stronger union in order to protect because the journalists as well. Because when we talk about human rights defenders, basically journalists also fall into the same categories, especially for those journalists who actually covered the topics, sensitive topics like this in the context of Southeast Asia on resistance movements and the social movements. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Khoo. Dr. Welyne, do you agree with Dr. Khoo when she says that journalists are human rights defenders, especially when you talked about indigenous communities and minorities. And most of the time it's their human rights being trampled that brings out the visualization of resistance movements.
It depends on the situation, I must say. But I do feel strongly that a lot of journalists out there that engage with the subject, the individuals of community, they really bring out the human rights debate. You know, they really address the basic human rights. So in terms of indigenous people, I think there's a lot of room for improvement because sometimes it is a bit hard to uncover the real situations because of many reasons. Like, for example, the case among the Penan people, for example, it's not easy for you to write in details because it's not easy to access. And I know that most of the stories about the Penan has been written by foreign journalists who actually go there and live there, you know, and then sit there. And our local journalist, for example, has not been able to do the same. And I know the restrictions, firstly, because of permission. Secondly, journalists from our country, for example, they are very exposed in the sense that you guys always play by the rule, you know, like you always ask for permit before you go in, and of course your permit will be revoked, will be rejected. As researcher, like Ying was saying, I'm not a journalist, but I was denied of permit to do research as well. So I cannot imagine how journalists would be allowed to go in, you know. So that's why I said it depends on the situation. Yeah, I hope that answered the question.
Right, and you also mentioned about the progress and development. Media doesn't. I mean, media takes it for granted that progress and development have come to these indigenous groups, and we also many times told by our editors that these are not sexy issues to cover. These are not interesting, not sensational issues to cover. So such reports on these sort of orang aslis or indigenous communities, I think it happens in other countries as well, where suddenly they are getting new houses, water, pipe water, electricity are reported. How does this kind of reports affect public attitudes towards these indigenous communities? What do you think?
As one of the public out there, when I read news like that, like the first question will be, is it for election? That's the first question, as we all know. Like nearing elections, there's a lot of politicians out there. I know this is public, but sometimes you just cannot hold your tongue, like, and I witnessed this in my own state, politicians or people who would like to stand in certain region would come with their army, I call it, with a few other peoples, or talking about like, we can give you this now because we are taking advantage of the election, and we can actually put the road, the electricity, if you want Wi-Fi, like every time before elections, you can hear that. Unfortunately, there is no journalist around to really cover the truth, So we do questions. Why suddenly these indigenous people get all these logistic problems, so have schools, this kind of thing. So there should be always questions why they have it, not just not just to report. And most of the time, you see the person who actually sponsor the housing, the schools, in front of the media, and the community are nowhere to be found. And that is really like, for me, it's very sickening, because the focus has to be on the people who receive. If you just take one picture, okay, for example, if you go to, I was covered a research on the Penang school dropout study, okay, but I signed a confidential not to publish this study. And I know a lot of the, a lot of corruptions in improving schools, building schools and all these kind of things, yeah, but we cannot say anything. So we are not supposed to publish it as academic journals, but I have all the reports in my office anyway, so anyone wants to write about it, you just come to my office and get it, because we cannot publish it as academic journals. And I think that journalists should engage with activist academics like Ying, Hooi, myself, and the others, because we have this very hot story. Just don't name the sources, just write it down. Or it could be, you just put one picture and then just write it down. It's something like that. It's very, I tell you, the adrenaline wanted to publish this kind of thing is the same as you are doing the blockade. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Welyne. We'll wrap up with, I just want to get a comment from each speaker, just maybe 2 or 3 lines on what you think the reporters, the media should do when they are struggling with reporting resistance. Should they go all out, or should we just be more creative, especially in Southeast Asia, where we have to be polite and nice and not be like Western reporters, which is what we always get. If you ask the hard questions, or you're like the Western reporter. So, how do we address that? Dr. Khoo, maybe you could answer that.
Yeah, I think this is a very similar question that always being put forward to the human rights activists as well. My view is that we do need to protect ourselves before we do anything. Otherwise, there's these things about some, they have the perceptions where, if you're a human rights activist or defenders, you should defend all out and ignore every other things. I do not agree with such a view. Hence, I will certainly say that please protect yourself. And that's why just now I said we do need a stronger unions and the networks to actually protect all of us who are working in this field. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khoo. Dr. Eduardo, what do you think?
Well, it has been said that journalism is now the most dangerous profession in the world today. For example, in the Philippines, no less than the Presidential Task Force on Media Security, so this is the government agency, has documented 187 journalists killed in the past 35 years. And since President Duterte came to power, 21 journalists have been killed. But there is a pattern going on here, because most of the journalists getting killed are journalists who are in the outlying areas, in the local areas, provinces, small newspapers, small media networks. There has not been actually any journalist from any of the major networks or anyone based in the Metro Manila area or major urban centers, for example, that have been killed, although they have been subjected to harassment. The most prominent, of course, is Maria Ressa, who was just accepted in the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, together with another journalist from Russia. She she's been charged with, I don't know, about 30 cases by the government because her organization, Rappler, has been very critical of government. So she had to seek permission to go to Norway to receive the Nobel Prize. She was granted that, but she could only stay for 5 days and has to come back. She's just out on bail, by the way. So, but journalists are citizens also. In a large sense, they are part of civil society, actually, although they would like to think of themselves as part of the fourth estate. But since they're not government and they're not also part of the market, we can actually consider them as part of civil society. So the thing to do to protect themselves is first to organize themselves. And there are organizations already existing of journalists in the Philippines as well as in other countries, Southeast Asia and in the world. And secondly is to coordinate and make connections with other civil society organizations, social movements, in order to strengthen their voice so that they cannot be easily intimidated, so that we cannot say that they stand alone in protecting the right of journalists to say it as it is.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Eduardo. Okay, Dr. Welyne, what do you think? Do you think we should start weaving?
No, you don't have to weave. But journalists are human. You know, they have human rights. So if in places that is almost impenetrable, why not use informants, for example? You know, I mean, I've seen in movies some journalists, you know, like using some informants to penetrate some kind of hard, difficult issues, for example, in order to protect themselves. So it doesn't mean that you have to be there then and stay there and then to report all the details. But if I look at some of the, I'm sure you all know about the 1MDB cases with Mrs. Brown, for example. I mean, the way she took things a bit too drastic to progress, in the sense that she was risking herself to travel in the interior, you know, to expose herself to the state government, for example, and she has a lot of charges. Of course, it makes her famous. At the same time, she is covering the things as well. But I do think that some of our decent journalists is not wanting to make themselves famous, but they would like to report such things. So protections for themselves is very important. And I do feel that community can actually protect them in certain way if they really do go into the community.
Right. Okay, we have come to the end of the class. Thank you so much. It was very enlightening to hear from people passionate about the topic. Dr. Khoo, I know, I have followed her for many, many years. I have yet to meet her. I have seen her in person. I've yet to meet her in person. You know, Dr. Welyne, you are much sought after, very respected. Dr. Eduardo, have read your papers for decades when talking about Philippines and all that. And the participants, the very, very patient participants, thank you so much to kiniacademy. Thank you very much. I will now take my leave and hand it over back to Danny. Thank you, Danny, and thank you all.
Oh, no, thank you to all the speakers, really. What a great discussion. I think what's shared today, I think is rarely heard out there. And we're glad that we have this forum to get your views out there and your perspective out there for all to consider. So thank you all for you. Keep fighting the good fight. Don't be surprised when you get a call from me or a text from me. We, in our work with investigative journalism, we do take it upon ourselves to pursue stories that needs to be aired, And I hear your call as an open call for us to reach out to you and have our journalists work with you to chase down those stories. So that's that. And thank you for all the participants for staying on. And this is the end of our series of masterclass. There won't be any more in December at least. As I mentioned, we do plan to have a repeat of this at least for the next year. And do reach out to your colleagues to collaborate. There's plenty of opportunities. We need to prove the rest of the world wrong that ASEAN journalists do not reach out enough to each other across the border to chase down stories that are of interest. You know, I know the journalists in the Mekong Delta, the Mekong region area, have got many cross-border stories, cross-border incidents that warrant, you know, this sort of cross-border effort. So, you know, there's plenty of them in our group. So meanwhile, I hope you guys will complete the surveys, at least the journalists, and tell us what you think. As usual, we also want to get feedback from you guys to do things better and to gauge the effectiveness of our session. As I mentioned, we fully intend to repeat this, of course, with different topics next year. So you completing the survey would be really helpful for us. So meanwhile, thank you again for the speakers. If you guys wish to leave, it's all right. So because we'll just finish up things here with our colleagues. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe.